You walked to the east wall where the two small shutters were still closed, fastened with a loop of hemp cord over a peg. The cord was rough against your fingers, a familiar texture, and when you lifted the loop free, the shutter swung outward with a low wooden groan that seemed to belong to the night rather than the day. Cool air poured in and mixed with the warmer workshop air, and the square of sky outside was the color of unwashed wool. You opened the second shutter, then the larger one on the south side that looked out toward the lane leading to the settlement, though there was nobody on the lane at this hour, and nothing moved except a single thread of smoke rising from a distant chimney. The light that came in now was pale and thin, just enough to show the edges of things, the low workbench against the wall, the kick-wheel standing in the center of the floor, the shelves holding jars and bowls and unfired pots in various stages of drying. The floor of the workshop was hard-packed earth, swept smooth by years of your own footsteps, and it felt cool through the thin leather soles of your sandals. You crossed to the bench and touched the surface with your palm, checking that it was clean. It was. Yesterday you had scraped it down with a flat piece of sandstone and wiped it with a damp rag, and now it was ready for a fresh day's work. Along the back edge of the bench, arranged in a neat row, your tools waited: the wooden rib, the metal trimming blade, the bone stylus, the scrap of soft leather for smoothing, the small bowl of water that had evaporated a little overnight but still held enough to wet your fingers. You looked at each tool in turn, not because you needed to count them, but because the act of looking, of acknowledging each one, was part of the slow ritual that separated the stillness of arrival from the beginning of work. Beside the bench stood a wide, shallow trough made of fired clay, covered with a length of damp linen. You lifted a corner of the cloth and peered at the clay within. It was the clay you had dug and prepared 2 days ago, a pale grey-brown mass that held the imprint of your wedging from the day before. The surface was still pliable, still damp enough to work, and when you pressed your thumb into it, the clay gave way with a soft, silent yielding. You pulled the cloth back over it and made a small adjustment to one corner where the linen had folded back on itself, tucking it down neatly so the clay would not dry too quickly. There was no urgency. The clay would wait as long as you needed. It always waited. You turned then to the water basin, a large pottery bowl that rested on a 3-legged stand near the door. You had filled it from the settlement well the previous evening, and now the water was cool and clear, with a few tiny specks of ash floating on the surface. You dipped your hands in and rubbed them together slowly, feeling the water run over your knuckles and wrists, washing away the dust of your short walk from the house. The sound of the water was a soft splashing, contained and unhurried, and when you were finished, you dried your hands on a cloth that hung from a peg on the wall, the linen rough and absorbent against your skin. Now there was more light. The sky outside the shutters had shifted from wall grey to a faint, watery yellow, and the shadows inside the workshop were no longer black, but a softer brown. The kick-wheel stood in its place in the center of the room, a simple construction of wood and stone, a vertical axle set into a socket in the floor, a heavy stone flywheel at the bottom, and a wooden wheelhead at the top. You walked around it once, trailing your fingers along the edge of the flywheel, feeling the cool, smooth wood under your touch. The wheel was old, older than you in this workshop, and it had absorbed countless hours of spinning, countless hands. You checked the axle for any looseness, pressing down on the wheelhead with both hands and rocking it gently from side to side, but it sat firm, and true. There was nothing to adjust, nothing to repair. It was ready. You fetched a small sack of fine river sand from the corner by the kiln shed, where you kept a supply for the wheel. The sand was pale and dry, and it trickled into your palm with a soft hiss. You sprinkled it over the wheel head in a thin, even layer, then used the flat of your hand to spread it smoothly across the surface. The sand would keep the clay from sticking as you worked, and the faint grit under your palm was a familiar sensation, as familiar as the wood grain of the bench, or the curve of the water basin. When the wheel head was evenly coated, you brushed the excess sand from your hands and let it fall to the floor, where it would be swept up later along with the clay scraps and dust of the day. A small clay lamp, one of your own making, sat on a shelf above the bench. You took it down and set it on the bench, then fetched a flint and a piece of iron from the little niche beside the door. The routine was old and comfortable. You held the flint just above the wick and struck it with the iron once, twice, and on the third strike a tiny orange spark jumped into the oil-soaked fibers and caught. The flame was small and yellow, barely larger than a bean, but it was enough to see by when the morning light was still thin. The lamp burned with a faint, pleasant smell of olive oil, and you watched the flame for a moment, noting how it bent slightly toward the open shutter before settling into a steady, upright shape. You left the lamp on the bench, where its glow added a soft warmth to the cool morning. Now the workshop was fully awake, but you were not yet working. You stood in the middle of the floor, your hands resting lightly at your sides, and let your attention move slowly around the room. The walls of wattle and daub, patched here and there with fresh clay where the old plaster had cracked. The rafters overhead, darkened by years of smoke and dust. The row of drying pots on a high shelf, their pale forms barely visible in the shadows. The stack of split firewood for the kiln, waiting in the corner. The small window that now showed a pale blue skies dissolved. There was a deep, pervasive stillness to the place, a quiet that was not emptiness, but a kind of presence, the accumulated calm of many days spent making, many nights spent firing. You took a slow breath and let it out. The air tasted the same as always, earthy, cool, slightly damp. It was the taste of clay and waiting. You went to the bench and picked up the wooden rib, a tool shaped like a flat spoon with a smooth curved edge. You turned it over in your hands, feeling its weight, checking the edge for any splinters or nicks. It was smooth and polished from years of use, the wood darkened to a deep honey color. You set it down again and picked up the metal trimming blade, a thin crescent of iron set into a wooden handle, and tested its sharpness with your thumb. It was still sharp enough. You had honed it on a whetstone only a few days ago. The bone stylus came next, a slender pointed tool made from the leg bone of a sheep, and you held it up to the lamp flame, rolling it between your fingers, watching the light catch the faint scratches near the tip, where countless lines had been drawn. Each tool was an extension of your hand. Each one had its own place on the bench, and each one was ready. You reached for the small bowl of water and added a little more from the basin, pouring carefully so as not to spill. The water in the bowl was for dipping your fingers while you worked, to keep the clay from sticking to your skin, and you always made sure it was fresh at the start of the day. The old water from yesterday you tipped out into the dust by the door, where it made a small dark patch that would dry within the hour. Then you refilled the bowl and set it back in its place. The sound of the water pouring was a soft, liquid note in the silence. Now you returned to the clay trough and folded back the damp linen entirely. The clay lay there, a large mass of it, roughly the size of a man's chest, its surface glistening faintly in the lamplight. You leaned over it and inhaled. The scent was clean and mineral, like the smell of a riverbank after rain. You pressed your hand into it again, harder this time, feeling the cool resistance give way to the warmth of your palm. It was good clay, well weathered, free of stones and roots. You had prepared it yourself, digging it from the pit behind the workshop, soaking it in water, sieving it through a cloth, and then leaving it to settle in a shallow pit until the excess water drained away. The process took days, and you had done it so many times that your body knew the rhythm without thought. Now the clay was ready to become lamps. You lifted a smaller lump of clay from the main mass, a piece about the size of a melon, and carried it to the wheel. You placed it on the sanded wheelhead and pressed it down firmly so that it stuck in place. Then you sat down on the low stool, a three-legged wooden seat that had worn smooth hollows where your thighs rested. The stool was set at exactly the right distance from the wheel, a distance you had found after years of small adjustments, and now you sat into it without looking, trusting your body to remember. You settled your feet on the lower part of the axle, one foot resting on the stone flywheel and the other on the crossbar, and you gave a slow, experimental push. The wheel turned with a low, steady hum, the sound of well-fitted wood and stone moving together, and the ball of clay on the wheelhead began to rotate. You watched it spin, the grey-brown surface blurring slightly, and you felt the familiar, soothing rhythm of the motion in your legs and hips. But you did not begin to throw yet. The lamp flame flickered gently on the bench. The sky outside had brightened a little more, and somewhere in the settlement a rooster called, a faint, distant sound that came through the open shutters like a memory. You sat still on the stool, your hands resting on your knees, and let the wheel slow to a stop. There was a whole day ahead, a day of clay and water and fire, a day of making one lamp, and then another, and then another, each one like the last, each one a small vessel for light. The order from the border fort would be filled, the lamps would travel north along the old road, and they would burn in guard posts and soldiers' quarters and the small shrines that stood at the crossroads. But all of that was far away, in a future that did not touch this moment. Right now, in the quiet workshop, there was only the lamp, the clay, the tools, and you. You lifted your hand and touched the clay on the wheel, just a light touch with the tips of your fingers, feeling the slight roughness of the sand beneath, the cool firmness of the clay itself. The clay was patient. It held its shape and waited for you to begin. You could sit here for another hour, another 2 hours, and the clay would not change, would not demand, would not hurry. That was one of the things you liked about this work. This life, the materials did not rush. The fire in the kiln did not care whether it was Tuesday or Thursday. The clay dried in its own time, and the pots cooled in their own time. There was a deep and gentle lesson in that, a lesson you had learned without ever putting it into words, and it lived now in the slow movements of your hands and the calm, even pace of your breath. A small sound came from outside, the soft crunch of footsteps on the lane. You turned your head slightly and listened, but the footsteps passed on, fading toward the main road, probably a farmer heading to the fields, or the baker's boy carrying flour. The settlement was small, a cluster of houses and workshops and a small temple built along the line of the old frontier road. The fort was half a day's walk to the north, and the soldiers sometimes came down to the settlement to buy supplies or to place orders for equipment, like the lamps you were making now. But that was all background, a faint hum of activity at the edge of your awareness, never intruding on the quiet center of the workshop. You turned back to the wheel. You dipped your fingers in the bowl of water and held them over the clay, letting a few drops fall onto the surface. The water caught the lamplight and glistened for a moment before being absorbed. You placed both hands on the clay now, cupping it gently, and you began to center it, pressing inward as the wheel spun slowly under your foot. The clay wobbled at first, a slight unevenness that you felt through your palms, and you adjusted your pressure, left hand a little firmer, right hand a little softer, until the wobble smoothed away and the clay ran true. There was a deep satisfaction in that moment, a quiet rightness that you never tired of, when the mass of earth became a steady, balanced thing under your hands. It was like finding the center of stillness within yourself, a point of calm that matched the calm of the workshop. You shaped the clay into a smooth dome, and then pressed your thumbs into the top, slowly letting the wheel turn at a steady pace. The clay opened under your touch, a hole widening into a depression, and you felt the walls thickening around your thumbs as you pressed deeper. You drew the clay upward then, pulling gently between your fingers and palm, and the walls rose, thin and even, into the shape of a small bowl, a lamp body. The motion was so familiar that your mind could drift while your hands worked, and it did drift now, settling into a soft, formless awareness of the lamplight, the hum of the wheel, the cool air on your face. You were not thinking, you were simply doing, and the doing was as calm and effortless as breathing. When the lamp body was the right size, you slowed the wheel and examined your work. The bowl was round and smooth, with a slightly flattened bottom and a rim that turned outward just enough to hold a wick. You took a thin wire, a length of gut that hung from a nail on the side of the wheel frame, and you passed it under the base of the lamp, soaring gently back and forth until the piece came free. You lifted it with both hands, careful not to distort the shape, and carried it to the drying board, where you set it down among the other empty spaces that would be filled before the day was over. The damp clay shone faintly in the lamplight, and you smoothed a small thumbprint from the rim before turning away. There were many lamps to make, enough to fill a crate that would be loaded onto a cart and taken to the fort. You had made the same order before, last season and the season before that, and each time the lamps were the same, simple, sturdy, made to hold oil and a floating wick, with a small handle on one side and a pinched spout on the other. The soldiers used them for night watches and for lighting the small rooms in the barracks, and they would burn for hours on a single filling. You knew the shape by heart, and your hands could produce it without your mind needing to direct them. So you returned to the clay trough, pulled another lump from the mass, and carried it to the wheel to begin again. The morning light was now full and steady, a clean, colourless brightness that filled the workshop and made the lamp flame seem pale and small. The shadows under the bench and behind the kiln shed withdrew, and the colours of the room emerged, the warm brown of the wooden shelves, the grey-white of the plastered walls, the rust-red of the clay-tile roof, the dull iron of the trimming tools. You worked in this light, throwing lamp after lamp, your body moving in a steady rhythm. Take the clay, centre it, open it, pull up the walls, cut it free, set it on the board. The sounds of the workshop were a soft repetition. The hum of the wheel, the wet slip of clay under your fingers, the gentle tap of the wire against the wood, the quiet footsteps as you moved between the wheel and the drying board. Nothing broke the pattern, and you did not want it broken. By the time the sun had risen high enough to send a direct beam through the south window, a slanting rectangle of light that fell across the floor and touched the edge of the wheel, you had made a dozen lamp bodies, and they sat in a neat row on the drying board, each one identical to the last, each one waiting for its spout and handle. You stood and stretched your back, feeling the pleasant ache of muscles that had held one position for a long time, and you walked to the door to look out at the lane. The settlement was awake now. The sound of voices and the clatter of a cart drifting up from the direction of the market square. But here, at the edge of things, by the workshop door, it was still quiet. A small brown bird hopped along the eaves, and a cat lay sleeping on a warm stone nearby. You stood for a while, letting the sun warm your face, and then you turned back inside. The rest of the morning would be for making spouts and handles, and then in the afternoon, when the lamp bodies had stiffened to leather hard, you would trim them and add the simple decoration that marked them as your work. But that was later, and this was now. Now you went to the water basin and washed the clay from your hands, rubbing them together under the cool water until the grey slip ran clean and your skin felt smooth again. You dried your hands on the cloth and poured yourself a cup of water from the jug that sat on the floor, drinking it slowly, feeling the coolness travel down your throat. The lamp on the bench had burned low, its oil nearly spent, and you pinched the wick out between your thumb and forefinger, leaving the faintest trail of smoke that twisted upward and disappeared. The workshop was bright now, and the lamp was no longer needed. You returned to the bench and sat down, not to work, but simply to be still. You looked at the row of lamp bodies still damp and soft, and you thought about the fire they would one day contain, the small flames that would push back the darkness in places you had never seen. It was a quiet thought, without weight or urgency, the kind of thought that drifted through your mind like a leaf on a slow stream and then drifted away. You picked up the bone stylus and held it loosely, tracing its point along the grain of the bench without making a mark, and then you set it down again. The day was still young, and there was no reason to hurry. Outside, a cloud passed across the sun, and the workshop dimmed for a moment, then brightened again. The cat on the stone outside shifted in its sleep, curling its tail over its nose. The small brown bird had flown away. Inside, the air was still and warm, smelling of clay and water and the faintest trace of olive oil. You sat on the stool by the bench, your hands folded loosely in your lap, and let the peace of the workshop settle around you like a blanket. The lamps would be made. The kiln would be fired. The cart would come. But all of that lay in the hours ahead, and for now there was only this: the soft hum of silence, the patient clay, and the slow, steady rhythm of a day that asked nothing more than what you were already doing. The workshop had grown warm with the climbing sun, and the row of lamp bodies on the drying board had begun to lose their surface gloss, fading from a wet shine to a soft, matte grey. You wiped your hands on the cloth that hung from the bench peg, and looked at the clay trough where the main mass of prepared clay sat under its damp linen cover. There was still a good amount left, enough for the handles and spouts and for the smaller lamps you would throw later in the week. But you knew from long habit that it was always better to have fresh clay ready and waiting, rather than to stop in the middle of a rhythm to fetch more. The clay pit behind the workshop was full. the last digging of the season before the autumn rains, and the material there was well rested, moist, and ready for use. You decided to bring in a new batch now, while the morning was still cool enough for the short walk and the heavier work of wedging. You left the workshop by the back door, a narrow entrance that opened onto a small yard enclosed by a low, dry stone wall. The ground here was bare earth, packed hard by your own footprints over the years, and a few stray weeds grew along the base of the wall, their leaves pale and dusty. The clay pit lay about 40 paces beyond the wall, a shallow rectangular trench that you had dug yourself, and then lined with flat stones to keep the edges from collapsing. Over the top, a length of coarse sacking was stretched and held down at the corners with heavy stones, protecting the clay beneath from the direct sun and from the drying wind that sometimes swept down from the northern hills. The sacking was damp, darkened in patches where moisture had wicked up from below, and when you knelt beside the pit and pulled back one corner, the smell of clean, wet earth rose up to meet you, rich and cool and faintly metallic, like the scent of a stream bed in deep shade. The clay in the pit was a pale grey-brown color, the same as the clay you had already been using, but it looked different here in its resting state. It lay in a thick layer, the surface smooth and slightly dimpled from the last time you had pressed it down. You reached in and scooped up a small handful, squeezing it in your palm to test its readiness. The clay was cool and heavy, and it yielded to pressure without cracking, leaving a faint sheen of moisture on your skin. It was perfect, still fully plastic, not yet beginning to stiffen at the edges where the sacking did not quite reach. You crumbled the handful back into the pit and brushed the remaining traces from your palm against the side of your tunic. Beside the pit, leaning against the stone wall, was your wooden spade, a simple tool with a broad flat blade and a handle worn smooth by your grip. You picked it up and stepped down into the shallow trench, the cool clay pressing softly against the soles of your sandals. The pit was only knee-deep, just enough to hold the dug clay without making it difficult to reach, and you stood there for a moment, looking down at the material that was the beginning of everything you made. It had been dug from the bank of the small stream that ran along the eastern boundary of the settlement, a place where the water had cut through a layer of ancient sediment and left a clean stone-free deposit. You had carried it here in baskets over the course of several afternoons, and now it had rested for a full season, the long months of resting, allowing the tiny particles to settle into a uniform, workable mass. There was a quiet patience to the pit, a sense of waiting that matched the feeling in the workshop itself, and you felt the same calm settle over you as you began to work. You pushed the spade into the clay with a slow, steady pressure, using the weight of your body rather than any sudden force. The blade sank in with a soft, wet sound, and you levered it gently upward, lifting a large clump of clay that clung to the wood. You placed this clump onto the ground beside the pit, then repeated the motion, cutting another section and stacking it on top of the first. The work was slow and rhythmic. Push, lever, lift, place. The clay released from the blade with a soft, sucking noise each time, and the pile on the ground grew gradually, a mound of grey-brown material that glistened faintly in the morning light. You worked without hurry, pausing now and then to shift your weight or to rest your hands on the spade handle and look out across the yard toward the workshop, where the shutters stood open and the shadows of the roof beams stretched across the interior wall. When you had lifted enough clay to fill the wedging bench for a good session, you climbed out of the pit and laid the spade aside. you knelt by the pile and used both hands to gather the clay into a single large mass, pressing the separate clumps together so they would not dry on the walk back. The clay was heavy, and you lifted it with care, cradling it against your chest like a sleeping child. It was cool through your tunic, and you could feel the slight give of it against your arms, the weight shifting as you walked. The path back to the workshop was short, and you moved slowly, watching your footing on the uneven ground, your sandals making soft scuffing sounds on the packed earth. Inside the workshop, the air was still and a little warmer than outside. You carried the clay to the wedging bench, a sturdy wooden table that stood against the north wall, its surface plain, smooth and stained, a deep, permanent grey from years of absorbing clay dust and water. You set the mass of clay down gently, letting it settle onto the wood with a soft, damp thud. Then you straightened up and took a moment to catch your breath, though you were not winded, and to let your arms adjust to the sudden lightness. The bench was at the right height for wedging, high enough that you could lean your weight into the work without bending too far, and you ran your palm across its surface to check that it was clean. A few flakes of dried clay from the previous session still clung to one corner, and you scraped them away with a fingernail before brushing the whole surface with the side of your hand. The lump of fresh clay sat in the center of the bench, an irregular mound that still bore the marks of the spade and your hands. You broke it into two smaller pieces, each about the size of a large loaf of bread, and set one piece aside under a damp cloth while you worked the other. This was how you always began a wedging session, with a single manageable portion, something your hands could handle without strain, so that the motion could settle into its natural rhythm before you moved on to the larger mass. You placed your palms on the clay and pressed down, feeling the cool, firm resistance push back against you. The first motion of wedging was a push, a forward and downward movement of both hands that compressed the clay against the bench and began to spread it into a flattened oval. You then lifted the far edge, folded it back over itself, and pressed again, driving your weight through your shoulders and into the heels of your hands. The clay yielded slowly, its internal structure beginning to rearrange, the tiny plate-like particles sliding over one another in response to the pressure. There was no sound except the soft, rhythmic thump of the clay against the wood, a muffled beat that repeated again and again, as steady as a heart. You fell into the rhythm without thinking, your body remembering the pace while your mind drifted into a quiet, unfocused calm. You worked the clay this way for many minutes, pushing, folding, pressing, turning. With each fold you rotated the mass slightly, a quarter turn that ensured the pressure was applied evenly from every direction. The motion was not hurried. Your hands moved at the same unhurried pace they always did, a pace that allowed the clay to respond without tearing and without trapping air. Air was the enemy of a good firing, small pockets of it that would expand in the kiln heat and shatter the work. But here at the bench the air was being worked out silently, squeezed from the clay with each pressing fold. You could feel the change under your palms as the mass grew more uniform, the slight granular resistance of the beginning giving way to a smoother, silkier texture. It was a gradual transformation, barely noticeable from one fold to the next, but after a while you could tell that the clay was becoming ready, becoming a single, cohesive body rather than a collection of smaller pieces pressed together. You paused once, lifting your hands from the clay and turning them over to look at your palms. They were coated with a thin layer of grey slip, the fine clay particles suspended in the moisture that had been squeezed to the surface. The slip was cool and slippery, and you rubbed your hands together slowly, feeling the smooth frictionlessness of it before wiping the excess onto the edge of the bench. Then you resumed your position and continued, the rhythm picking up exactly where it had left off, as though there had been no pause at all. The clay needed a little more water now. You could tell because the surface was beginning to show tiny cracks, fine lines that appeared when the outer skin dried faster than the interior. You reached for the bowl of water that sat at the back of the bench, a small shallow dish that you had filled earlier from the basin, and you dipped your fingers into it. The water was cool, and you flicked a few drops onto the clay, watching them bead up for a moment before you pressed them in with your next pushing motion. The clay absorbed the water instantly, softening under your hands, and the fine cracks disappeared. You added a little more water, just enough to restore the pliability, and continued the folding, pushing, turning. The slip formed again, this time a little thinner and milkier, and it worked its way between your fingers as you pressed. The sensation was pleasant, the cool slickness of the clay water sliding over your skin, filling the creases of your knuckles and the spaces under your nails. There was something deeply calming about it, the way the material gave and flowed and yet held its shape, the way your hands could shape it without force, only with steady, patient pressure. You thought about the lamps you would make from this clay, the same lamps you had been making for years, and you saw their finished forms in your mind, the small rounded bodies, the pinched spouts, the looped handles, the incised patterns that were simple and unchanging. But the thought was distant, a faint image that floated through your awareness without demanding attention, and it drifted away as you continued to work. The morning light had shifted again while you wedged. The bright rectangle that had fallen across the wheel earlier had moved, sliding across the floor and climbing halfway up the wall of the kiln shed, where it now illuminated the rough brickwork in warm, golden tones. The workshop was quieter now than it had been earlier. The sounds of the settlement had faded into the background, and the only noises were the soft, steady thump of your wedging and the occasional rustle of the damp cloth when a draught stirred the room. The air smelled of wet clay and of the faint, clean scent of the water basin, and a small fly buzzed lazily near the high window before settling on a rafter to rest. Everything was still. Everything was slow. You finished the first portion of clay and set it aside, a smooth, evenly textured ball that held its shape perfectly when you let it sit. You covered it with a damp cloth to keep it from drying, then reached for the second portion you had set aside earlier. This one had stiffened slightly while you worked the first, the outer surface developing a thin, leathery skin, but when you pressed your thumb into it, the interior was still soft and moist. You began to wedge it, the same rhythm starting over, your hands moving into the familiar push and fold, without any need for conscious direction. The clay was a little cooler this time, having sat on the bench longer, and it took a few extra folds before the warmth of your hands began to soften it. But soon it was responding just as the first had done, yielding, smoothing, becoming uniform under your steady pressure. As you wedged, your mind wandered gently, not to any particular thought, but into a kind of soft, formless awareness of the present moment. You noticed the grain of the bench under your palms, the small indentations left by years of use, the way one corner of the wood had a slight warp that made the clay rock slightly if you pressed there. You noticed the sound of your own breathing, slow and even, and the way your shoulders moved with each push. You noticed the small patch of sunlight on the floor, now creeping even further up the wall, and the faint shadow of a bird passing quickly across the window, and then gone. There was no urgency in any of this noticing. It was simply the texture of the moment, the quiet fabric of a quiet morning, and it wrapped around you like a layer of soft wool. When the second portion was finished, you combined it with the first, pressing the two balls together on the bench and wedging them as a single larger mass. This was the final stage, the blending that ensured the entire batch was perfectly uniform, with no hidden seams or variations in moisture. The larger mass required a different stance, a slight shift of your weight, and you leaned into the work with your whole body now, using the strength of your legs and back as well as your arms. The motion was still slow, still unhurried, but it had a deeper, more grounded quality, like the turning of a millstone. The clay pushed back against you and you pushed against it, and in the space between the two pressures there was a balance, a quiet equilibrium that held you steady. You added a little more water from the bowl, just a sprinkle, and watched it disappear into the grey-brown surface. The clay was very smooth now, almost silky, and when you pulled off a small piece and rolled it between your palms it formed a perfect, crack-free coil. That was the test, the sign that the wedging was done. You pressed the coil back into the main mass and gave the whole thing a final few turns, shaping it into a neat, rounded mound that sat on the bench like a large grey loaf. Then you stopped, your hands resting on the surface of the clay, and you let out a breath you had not been aware of holding. The wedging bench was quiet. Your hands were covered in slip, grey and smooth, and you stood there for a moment, feeling the slow, pleasant ache in your shoulders and the warmth of the worked clay under your palms. The workshop was bright now, the sun fully up and the shadows sharp-edged, and the row of lamp bodies on the drying board had dried a little more, their surfaces now an even, chalky grey. They would be ready for trimming and spout attachment by the afternoon, which meant you had timed the morning well, but that was a thought for later. Right now, you simply stood still, letting the quiet settle back around you. You went to the water basin and washed your hands, watching the grey slip swirl away into the water and then settle slowly to the bottom of the basin. The water was still cool, and you splashed a little on your face, cupping it in your hands and pressing it to your cheeks and forehead. It was refreshing, but not startling, a gentle transition from the warmth of the wedging to the next part of the day. You dried your face and hands on the cloth, and then returned to the bench, where the prepared clay sat waiting under its damp cover. Before you moved on to the next task, you lifted the damp cloth and looked at the clay one more time. It was beautiful in its own quiet way, a smooth, formless mass of potential, holding within it the shape of every lamp and pots and bowl you would ever make. It asked nothing, expected nothing, and yet it would become something useful, something that would carry light into the darkness. You touched it with your fingertips, leaving the faintest imprint on the surface, and then you drew the cloth back into place and tucked the edges down neatly. The clay would rest now, keeping its moisture until you were ready to throw the next batch of lamp bodies or to form the small handles and spouts that would complete the pieces already drying on the board. Outside, the cat on the warm stone had woken and stretched, arching its back and yawning before settling down again in a slightly different position. The lane was quiet, the earlier traffic of carts and voices having moved on to the fields and the market. A light breeze stirred the dust near the door, then died away. Inside the workshop you took up your position at the bench once more, but not to work, not yet. You sat on the low stool and rested your forearms on the wood, feeling the grain under your skin, and you let your eyes close for just a moment, listening to the silence that was not silence, the soft, breathing stillness of the workshop that had been your world for so many years. The morning was half over, and the clay was ready, and the quiet stretched on ahead, unbroken and deep and infinitely calm. The prepared clay sat under its damp cloth on the wedging bench, a smooth, cool mass ready for the wheel. You lifted a corner of the linen and pulled away a piece roughly the size of a large apple, rolling it briefly between your palms to form a rough ball, then carried it across the workshop to where the kick wheel waited in its pool of morning light. The wheel head was still coated with the fine river sand you had sprinkled there earlier, and you brushed it lightly with your fingers to ensure the surface was even, before pressing the ball of clay firmly onto the center. It stuck at once, the moisture in the clay gripping the sand, and you gave it a gentle pat to seat it securely before lowering yourself onto the three-legged stool. The stool had grown warm from your earlier sitting, the wood smooth and familiar under your thighs, and you settled into it with the ease of long practice, your left foot finding the rest on the stone flywheel, while your right foot braced against the crossbar. You gave a slow, experimental push with your left foot, and the wheel began to turn, the heavy stone below gathering momentum with a deep, humming sound that filled the silence like water filling a bowl. The clay rotated before you, a grey-brown shape blurring at the edges, and you reached for the small bowl of water that sat on the wheel frame, dipping the fingers of your right hand and letting the excess drip back with a soft pattering sound. Centering the clay was the first step, and it was a step that never changed. You cupped both hands around the spinning mass, your left hand anchoring the clay from the side, while your right hand pressed down from above, the combined pressure guiding the material into alignment with the axle's rotation. At first there was a slight wobble, a faint eccentricity that you felt through your palms as a gentle rhythmic push against one hand and then the other, but you adjusted your pressure without thinking, left hand a fraction looser, right hand a little firmer, and the wobble subsided until the clay ran perfectly true. The sensation was one of quiet arrival, the moment when the formless lump became a stable, balanced thing, and you held it there for a few turns, simply feeling the smooth rotation under your cupped hands. The clay was at exactly the right moisture, the wedging having distributed the water evenly through every particle, and it responded to your touch with a pliant, silky give. You dipped your fingers again and then pressed both thumbs into the top of the dome, slowly, letting the wheel's motion do the work while your thumbs sank deeper into the center. The clay opened under the pressure, a small depression widening into a hollow, and you felt the cool interior of the mass against the tips of your thumbs. You drew them outward, gently widening the opening, and the walls of the lamp body began to rise around your fingers as though the clay were alive and willing, seeking its own shape under your guidance. Now you changed your hand position, slipping the fingers of your left hand inside the hollow while your right hand cupped the exterior. The two hands worked together, inside and outside, the gap between them defining the thickness of the wall. You pulled upward, a slow, steady movement that traveled from the base of the clay to the rim, and the wall rose, thinning and smoothing under the pressure. The feeling was of controlled yielding, the clay flowing upward between your fingers like thick cream, and you repeated the pull several times, each pass making the wall a little taller, a little more even. The wheel hummed its low, steady note, and your foot kept the rhythm, with small, regular pushes that maintained the speed without hurrying it. A lamp body was not a complicated shape, a simple open bowl with a slightly flattened bottom and a rim that curved outward just enough to support a wick. You had made this same shape so many times that your hands knew it better than your mind did, and as you worked, you let your attention drift into the soft, unfocused state that came with repetitive craft, the kind of awareness that notices everything and clings to nothing. The clay was cool and smooth against your skin. The water from the bowl trickled down your wrist when you dipped too deeply. The flywheel made a faint, rhythmic clicking where the wooden axle met the stone socket. These sensations flowed through you and passed on, leaving no trace, and you continued to pull and shape, your fingers moving with the unhurried precision of a lifetime's practice. When the lamp body was the right size, you removed your hands slowly, letting the wheel spin a few more times with the form complete and undisturbed. You then dipped a small sponge, a scrap of natural sea sponge that you kept in the water bowl, and held it gently against the rim as the wheel turned. The sponge smoothed away the tiny irregularities left by your fingers, leaving a clean, rounded edge that would hold a wick securely without cutting it. The sound of the sponge against the wet clay was a soft, whispery hiss, barely audible over the hum of the wheel, and the water squeezed from the sponge ran down the outside of the lamp body in thin, glistening rivulets. You let the wheel slow now, your foot resting, and the lamp body gradually came to a stop before you, its surface shining with a thin film of moisture, and its shape simple and true. The next step was to cut the piece free. You reached for the thin gut wire that hung from a nail on the side of the wheel frame, a length of twisted sheet gut that was strong and fine, and you held it taut between your two hands, your thumbs pressing down on the wire to keep it straight. You positioned it just under the base of the lamp body, against the sanded wheel head, and drew it toward you with a smooth, sawing motion. The wire passed through the clay with a faint, wet sigh, and the lamp body came loose, sitting free on the wheel head, like a small, perfect bowl. You lifted it with both hands, cupping it from underneath so as not to distort the still soft walls, and carried it the few steps to the drying board where the morning's earlier batch was already stiffening. You set it down gently at the end of the row, the base pressing slightly into the wood and holding there, and then you straightened up and looked at the line of lamp bodies that was beginning to grow. There were now 13 of them, each one a little different from its neighbors in ways that only you would notice, this one slightly wider at the rim, that one a fraction taller, another with a wall that was a hair thinner on one side. The differences were small, the natural variations of handmade work, and together they made a pleasing, irregular rhythm along the board, like notes in a quiet melody. You touched the rim of the newest lamp with your fingertip, just a light touch to check that it was smooth, and then you turned back to the wheel. You returned to the wedging bench and pulled another piece of clay from the mass, rolling it into a ball as you walked. The motion was so familiar that you did it without looking, your hands knowing the exact amount to take, the weight settling into your palm with a comfortable heft. You pressed this new ball onto the wheel head, gave it the same firm pat to seat it, and sat down again on the stool. The wheel had nearly stopped, its momentum spent, and you gave it a fresh push with your left foot, the flywheel groaning softly as it gathered speed once more. The new ball of clay began to spin, and you reached for the water bowl, dipped your fingers, and began the centering again. This second lamp went much as the first had done. the same quiet sequence of centering, opening, pulling, and shaping. But there were small variations that kept the work from becoming mechanical, tiny adjustments that your hands made in response to the clay's particular character. This piece was a little softer than the last, having come from nearer the top of the wedged mass where the moisture had settled slightly, and it wanted to slump if you pulled too quickly. You adjusted by slowing your pull, letting the clay take its time, and the wall rose more gradually under your patient guidance. The rim needed a little more attention too, a small thick spot that you worked out with a gentle sideways pressure from your thumb, while the wheel spun at a reduced speed. These were not problems, they were simply the clay's way of speaking to you, and you listened with your hands and answered with small, unhurried corrections that felt as natural as breathing. The wheel spun on, the flywheel's deep hum a constant companion, and the second lamp body took shape under your fingers. When it was finished, you cut it free with the gut wire and carried it to the drying board, setting it down beside the first. You paused for a moment, your hands resting on the edge of the board, and looked out through the open shutters of the lane. A cart was passing, a simple wooden cart pulled by a slow grey donkey, and the driver raised a hand in greeting as he went by. You returned the gesture, a small lift of your own hand, and then the cart was gone around the bend, and the lane was quiet again. The sun was higher now, the shadows shorter, and the air in the workshop had grown warm and still. You drank a little water from the jug by the door, the water cool and clean in your throat, and then you went back to the wedging bench for more clay. The morning had reached its middle point, the time when the light was at its brightest and the world outside was fully awake, but inside the workshop the quiet was unchanged. The same soft sounds repeated themselves, the hum of the wheel, the drip of water, the wet slip of clay under your hands, the occasional small creak of the stool as you shifted your weight. These sounds blended together into a kind of silence, a background texture that was as soothing as the sound of rain on a roof or the distant murmur of the sea. The third lamp you threw was a little wider than the others, a shape that came about because you opened the center more broadly with your thumbs before pulling the walls. It would hold more oil, you thought, without really thinking, and it might suit a guard post where the lamp needed to burn through the longest hours of the night. You gave the rim a slightly more pronounced outward curve to accommodate a thicker wick, and then you smoothed it with the sponge and cut it free. The fourth lamp was smaller, a compact shape that fit neatly in your cupped palms, and you set it on the board with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Each lamp was a small variation on a theme, a single note and a long, slow song, and the song continued as the morning wore on. You worked without counting, without keeping track of how many you had made or how many remained to be made. The order from the fort was for a specific number, a number that the centurion had written on a small wax tablet and left with you weeks ago, and you knew that number in the back of your mind. But here at the wheel, in the steady rhythm of throwing, the number did not matter. What mattered was the clay, the water, the motion of your hands, and the growing row of lamp bodies on the drying board. The rest would take care of itself, as it always did. The morning light shifted again, the bright rectangle that had been on the floor now climbing the wall and reaching the lower edge of the high shelf where the older, fully dried pots waited. Dust motes floated in the beam, tiny specks of clay and ash that drifted slowly, catching the light and then fading as they moved into shadow. You watched them for a moment, your hands still on a half-formed lamp, and then you returned your attention to the work. The clay was cool and responsive, and you opened it with your thumbs and began to pull the walls upward, your fingers finding the familiar thickness, the familiar curve. By the time the sun had climbed high enough that the direct beam through the south window began to narrow and retreat, you had made 2 full rows of lamp bodies on the drying board, 24 in all, their surfaces now drying to a pale, matte grey. The clay trough on the wedging bench was still well stocked, the damp cloth still holding in the moisture, and you knew you had enough material to make the full order and more. But the morning's throwing was done, the rhythm having naturally wound down as your arms grew pleasantly heavy and your attention began to soften at the edges. You cleaned the clay from your hands at the water basin, rubbing them together under the cool water and watching the grey slips swirl away, then dried them on the cloth and poured yourself another cup of water from the jug. You walked back to the drying board and stood looking at the rows of lamp bodies. They were all the same and all different, a family of shapes that shared a common purpose. The clay was still soft enough to take a thumbprint, and you resisted the urge to touch them, knowing that any mark you made now would remain through the firing. Instead you simply looked, your eyes moving along the rows, noting the small variations in shape and size, the way the light fell across the curved surfaces and cast soft shadows on the board. There was a deep, quiet pleasure in this looking, a satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride or accomplishment, and everything to do with the simple fact of things made well, things made slowly, things made with care. The workshop was warm and still, the air carrying the mingled scents of wet clay and water and the faint, lingering trace of the morning's lamp oil. The wheel stood silent now, the flywheel motionless, a thin film of dried clay slip on the wheel head beginning to crack into tiny, curling flakes. You would clean it later, before the next session. For now, you left it as it was, and went to the bench where your tools lay in their neat row, the wooden rib and the metal blade and the bone stylus, all waiting for the afternoon's work of trimming and decorating. You picked up the bone stylus and turned it over in your fingers, feeling its smooth, cool surface, and then you set it down again. Outside, the cat had returned to its warm stone and was washing its face with a slow, methodical paw. The lane was empty, the settlement quiet in the midday lull. A faint breeze stirred the dust and then settled, and the only sound was the distant, intermittent call of a bird from the direction of the stream. Inside the workshop, you pulled the stool away from the wheel and sat down against the wall, your back resting against the cool, rough plaster, and you closed your eyes for a moment. The darkness behind your eyelids was restful, and the quiet wrapped around you like a blanket, and you let yourself drift for a while, neither awake nor asleep, simply resting in the pause between one part of the day and the next. The lamp bodies on the drying board continued to dry, their colour shifting from dark grey to a paler, chalky shade. They would be ready for trimming and the attachment of spouts and handles by the late afternoon, and you would work on them then, in the cooler hours when the sun had dropped behind the western hills and the workshop was filled with a soft golden light. But that was still ahead, a future task that could wait. Right now, in the quiet of the midday workshop, there was nothing that needed doing, nothing that called for your attention, nothing but the slow, steady passage of time and the gentle, patient presence of the clay. The lamp bodies had been resting on the drying board through the warmest hours of the afternoon, and now they were ready. You could tell by the way their colour had shifted from a wet dark grey to a pale chalky tone, and by the way the surface felt cool and firm when you touched it with the back of your finger, no longer sticky or yielding. They were leather hard, that perfect stage when the clay still held enough moisture to accept new attachments, but was stiff enough to keep its shape under pressure. You walked along the length of the drying board, looking at the rows of lamp bodies you had thrown that morning, and you selected the one nearest the end, the last piece you had made, which had dried a little less than the earlier ones, and would be the most forgiving to work with first. You carried the lamp body to the bench, setting it down on a small wooden bat that you used for trimming and assembly work, and you turned it slowly with your fingertips, examining the rim and the wall. The shape was good, the rim even, the base flat. There was a small rough patch on one side where the gut wire had dragged slightly during cutting, but that would be smoothed away later. For now, the lamp body was ready to receive its spout, the small pinched extension that would hold the wick in place and direct the flame. Without the spout, the lamp was just a simple bowl. With it, the bowl became a vessel for light, a thing with a purpose and a direction. The first task was to prepare a small batch of slip, the liquid clay that would act as a glue to bond the spout to the lamp body. You went to the wedging bench and scraped a few flakes of dried clay from the surface into a small cup, then added a little water from the bowl and stirred the mixture with a fingertip until it became a smooth, creamy paste, the consistency of thick cream. The slip had a pale grey colour and a faint earthy smell, and you set the cup beside the lamp body where it would be within easy reach. Then you took a small lump of fresh clay from the trough, a piece no larger than a walnut, and rolled it between your palms to warm it and soften it before you began to shape the spout. Shaping a spout was a small, precise motion that you had performed so many times it felt less like work and more like a habit of the hands. You pressed the little ball of clay into a short, thick cone, then flattened one side with your thumb and began to pinch the opposite end outward, drawing the clay into a tapered, lip-like form. The pinching was gentle, a series of small squeezes between thumb and forefinger, each one elongating the spout a little more and thinning its walls. You turned the piece as you worked, checking the shape from every angle, making sure the taper was even, and the opening at the tip was just wide enough to hold a flaxen wick without pinching it. The clay was cool and responsive, and it took the shape with a quiet willingness, the surface becoming smooth under your repeated, gentle pressure. When the spout was fully formed, you set it down on the bench and turned your attention back to the lamp body. You picked up a small pointed tool, a wooden awl with a sharp tip, and you scored a patch on the rim where the spout would attach, scratching a cross-hatched pattern of fine lines into the leather-hard surface. The scoring roughened the clay, giving the slip something to grip onto, and the sound it made was a soft, scratchy whisper, barely audible in the quiet workshop. You then dipped your fingertip into the cup of slip and painted a thin layer over the scored area, the slip spreading smoothly and darkening the pale clay as it went. You picked up the spout and scored its base to match, then pressed it gently onto the rim of the lamp body, aligning the taper so that it pointed outward and slightly upward, the way it would need to sit when the lamp was filled with oil and burning. The clay met the clay with a soft, almost silent contact, and you held the spout in place for a moment, feeling the slip begin to grip, the moisture from the slip softening the leather-hard surfaces just enough to create a bond. Then you released your hold and reached for a small, flexible rib made of wood, a tool with a smooth, curved edge that you used for blending joins. The blending was the most delicate part of the work. You dipped the rib in water and then drew it gently along the join where the spout met the lamp body, smoothing the line of attachment until the two pieces became one continuous surface. The rib moved in slow, even strokes, each pass pressing a tiny amount of clay from the spout into the lamp body and erasing the seam. You worked your way around the entire join, inside and out, adding a little more slip where the seam seemed dry and wiping away the excess with a damp finger. The motion was repetitive and soothing, the rib gliding over the clay with a faint wet hiss, and as you worked the join disappeared until there was no sign that the spout had ever been a separate piece. You set the rib down and looked at the lamp, turning it slowly in your hands. The spout was now a seamless extension of the rim, the taper clean and even, the opening perfectly centered. You tested the bond by pressing very gently on the tip of the spout with your thumb, feeling the solid resistance of the joined clay, and there was no movement, no crack. The join was sound. You placed the lamp back on the wooden bat and reached for the next one on the drying board, the lamp body that had been thrown just before the last, and you began the whole process again. The afternoon light in the workshop had softened, the harsh brightness of midday giving way to a mellower golden glow that slanted through the south window at a lower angle. The shadows under the bench and behind the kiln shed had lengthened, and the air had cooled by a few degrees, enough to be pleasant on your skin. You worked in this gentle light, moving from lamp body to lamp body, each one receiving its spout in the same unhurried sequence, a small ball of clay shaped into a cone, pinched and tapered, a scored attachment point, a brush of slip, a careful pressing and blending. The motions repeated, but they did not feel monotonous. Each lamp was slightly different. Each spout required a tiny adjustment of angle or length, and your hand stayed attentive, awake to the particular needs of each piece, while your mind drifted into its familiar, restful calm. The sounds of the workshop were the same soft sounds that had accompanied you all day, the occasional drip of water from the sponge, the faint scrape of the wooden rib, the whisper of the scoring awl, the quiet exhale of your own breath. Outside, the lane was still. The settlement had settled into the slower rhythm of the late afternoon, and no carts passed, no voices called. Even the birds had grown quieter, saving their energy for the evening chorus. The only movement was the slow crawl of the sunbeam across the floor, its edge inching toward the foot of the drying board as the afternoon wore on. When you had attached spouts to a dozen lamp bodies, you paused to stretch your back and to drink from the water jug. The water was no longer cool, but still refreshing, and you drank it slowly, looking out through the open shutters at the pale sky. A few high clouds had formed, thin and wispy, and they drifted eastward with a slowness that matched the pace of your work. You wiped your mouth with the back of your hand and returned to the bench, where the remaining lamp bodies waited in their neat rows. The next stage was the handles, the small loops of clay that would be attached to the side of the lamp opposite the spout, giving the user something to hold when carrying the lighted lamp from room to room. A handle was a simple thing, a curved strip of clay that needed to be strong enough to bear the weight of the oil-filled lamp, but slender enough not to overpower the shape. You returned to the wedging bench and took another lump of fresh clay, a larger piece this time because the handles would require a good length of coil, and you began to work it in your hands, pressing and folding it into a smooth, even mass. To form the coils for the handles, you first rolled the clay between your palms into a thick sausage shape, then placed it on the clean surface of the wedging bench and began to roll it outward with both hands, using a light, even pressure. The clay lengthened under your palms, growing thinner and more uniform, the motion a gentle back and forth that traveled from the center of the coil out to the ends. You worked slowly, checking the thickness frequently by eye and by feel, making sure the coil was the same diameter along its entire length. If a section grew too thin, you would press it back together and roll again. If it was too thick, you would apply a little more pressure to that spot until it matched the rest. The clay yielded easily, still moist and pliable from the trough, and the coil soon lay on the bench like a long grey worm, smooth and regular and ready to be cut into lengths. You took the bone stylus from the tool row and used it to cut the coil into equal segments, each one about the length of your palm. These segments would become the individual handles, each one shaped into a simple loop. You picked up the first segment and curved it gently between your fingers, forming it into an arch, the ends pinched flat where they would attach to the lamp body. The curve was a natural, easy shape, and you held it up to the lamp body to check the size, making sure the handle would be large enough to fit a finger through, but not so large that it would look clumsy. You adjusted the curve slightly, widening it by a fraction, and then you were satisfied. The attachment of the handle was much the same as the attachment of the spout, using the same scoring and slipping technique. You scored 2 small patches on the side of the lamp body, one near the rim and one lower down on the wall, aligning them vertically so the handle would stand straight. You then scored the flattened ends of the clay loop, painted on the slip with the fingertip, and pressed the handle into place against the lamp body. You held it there for a count of several breaths, feeling the slip begin to grip, the moisture wicking into the leather-hard clay and creating a bond that would only strengthen as the piece dried. Then you released your hold and reached for the wooden spatula, a thin, flat tool with a rounded tip, which you used to blend the attachment points. The spatula moved in small, careful circles, pressing the clay of the handle into the clay of the lamp body, smoothing the transition until there was no visible seam. You added a tiny amount of slip where the join looked dry, working it in with the tip of the spatula, and then you smoothed the area with a damp fingertip to remove any tool marks. The handle now seemed to grow out of the lamp body as though it had always been there, the curve clean and symmetrical, the attachment points strong and smooth. You turned the lamp in your hands, checking the alignment of the handle relative to the spout, making sure the 2 features sat exactly opposite each other so the lamp would balance correctly when held. It was a small thing, but small things mattered, and you made a tiny adjustment to the handle's position, nudging it by a hair's breadth before the slip set. The first lamp with both spout and handle was now complete, and you set it back on the wooden bat with a quiet sense of something finished. It looked like a lamp now, not just a clay bowl, but a lamp with a purpose and a form that had been refined over centuries of use across the empire. You had seen lamps like this in the hands of soldiers and farmers and shopkeepers, in the small shrines by the crossroads, in the living quarters of the fort, where the officers kept their desks lit late into the night. Your lamps would join that long lineage, and you thought about that for a moment, a faint, distant thought, before letting it go and reaching for the next lamp body on the drying board. The afternoon continued in this way, a steady, quiet procession of spouts and handles, each lamp receiving its additions in turn. The work was repetitive, but not tiring, a gentle rhythm that occupied your hands while leaving your mind free to wander or to rest. You fell into a kind of walking meditation, a state of calm attention in which the boundaries between yourself and the work grew soft and indistinct. There was only the clay, the tools, the light, and the slow, even passage of time. The light through the south window deepened from gold to amber as the sun sank lower behind the western hills, and the shadows in the workshop grew longer and softer, losing their sharp edges. You lit the small oil lamp on the bench, the same lamp you had burned that morning, and its flame rose straight and steady in the still air, adding a warm flickering glow to the fading daylight. The lamp flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the scent of olive oil mingled with the earthy smell of the clay, creating an atmosphere that was both cozy and serene. You worked on into the early evening, attaching the last of the spouts and handles to the lamp bodies on the drying board. The final lamp of the batch was the smallest one, the compact shape you had thrown as a variation, and you gave it a slightly smaller handle to match, a delicate loop that fit neatly against its side. When it was done, you set it at the end of the row and stepped back to look at the full assembly of lamps, now all equipped with their spouts and handles, their forms complete and waiting only for trimming and decoration before the kiln. They sat in their rows like a gathering of quiet, patient creatures, their pale surfaces catching the lamplight and the last of the day. You cleaned your tools one by one, wiping the slit from the wooden rib and the spatula with a damp cloth, drying them with a scrap of linen, and returning them to their places on the bench. The bone stylus went back into its niche, the scoring awl beside it. The cup of slip was emptied and rinsed. The remaining slip poured back into the clay trough, where it would rejoin the main mass. You washed your hands in the water basin, the cool water turning grey and then clear as you rubbed your palms together, and you dried them on the cloth, feeling the familiar roughness of the linen against your skin. The workshop was quiet now in the way that evening. Quiet is different from morning quiet, a settled, restful silence rather than an expectant one. The shutters still stood open, but the sky outside had turned a deep, dusky blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light in the vast, darkening dome. You stood at the door and looked out at the lane, which was empty and still. The dust settled, the stones of the wall cool to the touch. The cat had gone from its warm stone, off to its nighttime prowling, and the only movement was a bat flickering silently overhead, chasing the last of the evening insects. You closed the shutters one by one, fastening each with its loop of hemp cord, the wood settling into its frame with a soft, solid thud. Inside, the lamp on the bench burned on, its flame steady and small, and you stood for a moment in its circle of light, looking at the rows of lamp bodies with their new spouts and handles, their forms now fully realized. Tomorrow they would be trimmed, smoothed, and decorated with the simple incised lines that marked them as your work, and then they would be stacked in the kiln for the long, slow firing. But tonight they were simply resting, drying further in the cool, still air, and you were ready to rest too. You picked up the lamp and carried it with you to the door, then paused to look back into the workshop. The rows of lamps were pale shapes in the darkness, arranged like a silent audience, and the wheel stood motionless in the center of the floor, its day's work done. Everything was in order, everything in its place, and the quiet was deep and complete. You stepped outside, latched the door behind you, and walked the short path toward your house, the lamp flame cupped in your hand and the cool night air soft against your face. Behind you, the workshop settled into its own silence, the clay and the lamps and the tools all waiting patiently for the morning, when the slow, careful work would resume. The morning light came pale and steady through the shutters, and the workshop was cool after the night, the air still carrying the faint, pleasant smell of damp clay and old ash. You unlatched the door and stepped inside, the familiar silence settling around you like a worn cloak, and you crossed to the bench where the rows of lamp bodies stood on their wooden bats, their spouts and handles now fully attached and firm. They had dried further overnight, the leather-hard surfaces having stiffened to a state that was no longer yielding to gentle pressure, but still held enough moisture to be worked without cracking. Their color had shifted again, from the chalky gray of yesterday afternoon to an even paler, almost white tone, and a fine dust of dried clay particles clung to the bats where the moisture had wicked out. You touched the rim of the nearest lamp with the tip of your finger, feeling the cool, smooth surface, and you found it ready for the next stage. The trimming tool waited on the bench where you had left it the night before, a thin crescent of iron set into a wooden handle, its edge honed to a dull sharpness that would cut the stiff clay cleanly without tearing. You picked it up and turned it over in your hand, checking the edge by running your thumb lightly along its length, a habit so old that you did it without thought. Beside the tool lay the scrap of wet leather you used for smoothing, a piece of soft goat skin that had been soaked in water and then wrung out until it was damp but not dripping. You lifted the leather and felt its cool, supple weight, then set it down again within easy reach. A small bowl of clean water sat at the back of the bench, and you dipped your fingers into it, letting the coolness settle against your skin before you dried them on the linen cloth. You chose the first lamp from the row, the one you had completed last the previous evening, and you carried it carefully to the bench, setting it upside down on a soft cloth so that the base faced upward. The base of the thrown lamp was never perfectly smooth. There was always a small ridge of excess clay where the gut wire had cut through, and the surface was slightly rough from the sand of the wheelhead. The trimming would remove this excess, creating a clean, flat base that would sit steadily on any surface, and it would also refine the overall shape by paring away any small irregularities from the lower walls. You settled onto the stool, the wood creaking softly under your weight, and you positioned the lamp so that the light from the window fell across it at an angle that revealed every contour. You took the trimming tool in your right hand, holding it with a light balanced grip, the handle resting against your palm while your forefinger guided the blade. With your left hand you steadied the lamp, your fingers spread gently around its rim, and you brought the blade to the clay at a shallow angle, just above the thick ridge of excess at the base. The first cut was always the most careful, a light, testing stroke that shaved away a thin curl of clay, the iron making a soft, scraping sound like a whisper against stone. The clay peeled away in a ribbon that held its spiral shape for a moment before dropping onto the bench, and you examined the surface beneath, checking the depth of the cut. It was good, just deep enough to smooth the roughness without thinning the base too much. You continued the trimming, rotating the lamp slowly with your left hand, while your right hand held the blade steady, the cutting edge moving along the surface in a smooth, continuous motion. The rhythm established itself quickly. Turn, cut, the blade whispering against the clay, the ribbons falling in soft spirals onto the cloth. The clay was at the perfect stage for this work, firm enough to cut cleanly without crumbling, yet still soft enough that the blade did not chatter or skip. You worked your way around the entire base, removing the excess ridge, and then feathering the cut upward into the lower wall of the lamp body, blending the trimmed area into the untrimmed surface so that there was no visible transition. The motion was slow and deliberate. Your attention focused on the thin line where metal met clay, the rest of the world fading into the quiet background of the workshop. When the base was finished, you turned the lamp over and set it upright on the bench, looking at the walls and the rim. There were small irregularities here and there, faint ridges left by your fingers during throwing, slight thick spots near the handle attachment where the slip had spread, and you addressed each one in turn with the lightest possible touch of the trimming blade. You did not reshape the lamp, only refined what was already there, paring away the tiny excesses until the surface flowed in a smooth, continuous curve from the base to the rim. The blade moved in short, feathery strokes, barely grazing the surface, and the clay dust that rose from the work was fine and pale, settling on the bench like a soft layer of flour. You paused now and then to brush the dust away with the edge of your hand, clearing the work area so you could see the surface clearly, and then you resumed the slow, patient trimming. The spout and handle required special attention. At the point where the spout joined the rim, a small ridge of slip had squeezed out during attachment, and although you had smoothed it with a rib the day before, it had become more visible as the clay dried and contracted. You used the very tip of the trimming blade to shave away this ridge, working with delicate, precise strokes that followed the contour of the join. The iron tip made a faint, scratching sound, higher pitched than the scraping of the broader edge, and the tiny curls of clay that came away were as thin as parchment. You worked slowly around the join, inside and out, until the transition was perfectly smooth, the spout seeming to emerge from the lamp body without any visible seam. The handle attachment received the same care, the blade tracing around the upper and lower joins, removing the faintest traces of excess slip and shaping the transition so that the handle flowed into the wall like a natural outgrowth. You set the trimming tool down and lifted the lamp, holding it at eye level and turning it slowly in the light. The shape was clean now, the base flat and true, the walls even, the joins seamless. But the surface was still slightly rough from the trimming, bearing the fine parallel scratches left by the blade, and those would need to be smoothed away before the lamp could be considered finished. You reached for the scrap of wet leather, squeezing a few drops of water onto the surface of the lamp from your fingertips before applying the leather in slow circular strokes. The smoothing was a different kind of work from the trimming, softer and quieter, the damp leather gliding over the clay with a faint, wet susurrus that was almost inaudible. You worked your way around the lamp body, the leather conforming to the curves and hollows, its surface carrying a fine slurry of clay and water that filled the tiny scratches and leveled the surface to a silky smoothness. The motion was repetitive and calming, the leather moving in small circles that overlapped one another, each pass blending into the next until the entire surface had been treated. You paid particular attention to the rim, running the leather around its entire circumference until the edge was rounded and smooth to the touch, a surface that would not cut a finger or fray a wick. The spout received a few extra strokes, the leather pressed gently into the tapered opening to smooth the interior as well as the exterior, and the handle was burnished along its entire length until it felt cool and sleek under your fingertips. You set the leather aside and looked to the lamp again. The surface was now a uniform, matte grey, smooth and flawless, with a soft, almost velvety texture that invited the touch. There was a quiet beauty to it, the beauty of a thing made well and carefully, and you held the lamp in both hands for a moment, feeling its solid, balanced weight before setting it down on a fresh wooden bat to dry further while you worked on the next piece. The lamp was ready for its final touch, the simple, incised decoration that would mark it as your work and add a small, quiet elegance to its functional form. You reached for the bone stylus, the slender, pointed tool that had been shaped from the leg bone of a sheep and polished smooth by years of use. It lay in its place among the other tools, and you lifted it carefully, feeling its light weight and the cool, dense smoothness of the bone. You tested the point against the pad of your thumb, finding it sharp but not needle-fine, a point that would cut a clean line into the clay without tearing or dragging. You set the stylus down beside the lamp and took a moment to decide on the pattern, though the decision was not really a decision at all, because you had been incising the same simple designs for as long as you'd been making lamps, and your hand would draw them without any need for conscious thought. The most common pattern was a row of dots, made by pressing the point of the stylus into the clay at regular intervals, a decoration that was quick to execute and pleasingly rhythmic in its repetition. The other pattern you sometimes used was a continuous zigzag line, a series of sharp alternating angles that ran around the rim of the lamp like a tiny mountain range. Both patterns were simple, both were old, and both served the same purpose, to add a small measure of care and attention to an object that would spend its life in the dim corners of guard posts and barracks rooms, seen only by the hands that lit it and the eyes that watched its flame. You chose the dot pattern for this first lamp, picking up the stylus and positioning the point just below the rim, where the decoration would be visible but would not interfere with the wick or the filling hole. The first dot was always the hardest, not because it was difficult to make, but because it set the spacing for all the others, and you wanted the spacing to be even and unhurried. You pressed the point into the clay with a gentle, steady pressure, feeling the slight resistance of the leather hard surface, and then the softer give as the point penetrated just deep enough to leave a clean, circular impression. The sound was a tiny, crisp tick, like a single raindrop falling on a leaf, and when you lifted the stylus, a small, neat dot remained, its edges sharp and its depth uniform. You moved the stylus a finger's width to the right and made a second dot, then a third, the rhythm establishing itself as your hand traveled around the lamp in slow, measured increments. The dots marched around the rim in a steady procession, each one placed with the same pressure and the same spacing, the stylus rising and falling with a quiet, hypnotic regularity. You turned the lamp as you worked, your left hand rotating it smoothly while your right hand kept the stylus aligned, and the pattern grew until it had encircled the entire rim and returned to its starting point. You examined the line of dots, checking the spacing with a critical eye, and you found it satisfactory, the intervals even, and the impressions clean. There was a quiet satisfaction in the completed pattern, the kind of satisfaction that came from small things done well, and you set the lamp aside and reached for the next one. The second lamp you decorated with a zigzag line, drawing the point of the stylus along the clay in a series of short, sharp strokes that changed direction with each angle. The stylus made a soft, scratchy sound as it moved, a continuous whisper that rose and fell with the rhythm of the lines, and the clay yielded easily under the bone point, parting in a clean, shallow groove. You guided the stylus around the rim, keeping the line parallel to the edge, the angles sharp and even, and when you had completed the circle you went back and deepened a few spots where the line had grown faint, touching them up with careful, precise strokes of the point. The The zigzag pattern had a different character from the dots, a little more lively, a little more dynamic, but still simple and understated. A decoration that would not call attention to itself, but would reward a close look. The morning wore on in this way, the quiet rhythm of trimming, smoothing, and incising carrying you from lamp to lamp. Each piece received the same unhurried attention, the careful pairing of excess clay with the metal blade, the gentle burnishing with the damp leather, the slow meditative drawing of patterns with the bone stylus. The work was repetitive, but not dull, the small variations in each lamp keeping your hands attentive while your mind drifted into the soft, unfocused calm that was the workshop's gift. The sounds of the morning were the familiar ones, the whisper of the trimming blade, the faint hiss of the damp leather, the tick and scratch of the stylus, the occasional rustle of your tunic as you shifted on the stool. Outside, the settlement carried on its quiet life, the distant sound of a hammer on metal, the bark of a dog, the murmur of voices passing on the lane, but all of it was muted, distant, like sounds heard through a thick fog. The light through the south window strengthened as the sun climbed, and the lamp bodies on the bench grew paler and cooler as the moisture continued to evaporate from their surfaces. You paused in your work to refill the water bowl from the basin, the water trickling in with a soft, liquid note, and you drank a cup of water yourself, standing by the door and looking out at the lane where a small group of children were playing with a stick and a ball of rags, their laughter thin and far away. The sky was a clear, pale blue, cloudless and calm, and the air had a touch of warmth that promised a pleasant afternoon. You returned to the bench, refreshed, and took up the stylus again. By the time the sun had reached its midday height, and the shadows had shrunk to small dark pools under the benches and shelves, you had finished the trimming, smoothing, and decoration of all the lamp bodies. They stood on the drying board in neat rows, their surfaces pale and matte, their simple patterns of dots and zigzags circling their rims like quiet prayers. You walked along the board and looked at each one in turn, your eye moving over the familiar shapes, noting the small differences that made each piece unique. A slightly deeper dot here, a marginally wider zigzag there, a handle that curved with a touch more grace than its neighbor. They were ready now, truly ready, for the kiln. All that remained was the firing, the long, slow transformation that would turn the pale, fragile clay into hard, durable terracotta, and that would come in its own time, when the lamps had dried completely and the kiln had been loaded and the fire had been lit. But that was a task for another day, or perhaps for the evening, if the drying progressed well. For now, in the warm stillness of the midday workshop, you cleaned your tools and returned them to their places, wiping the clay dust from the trimming blade with a cloth dipped in oil to keep the iron from rusting, rinsing the bone stylus in water and drying it carefully before setting it back in its niche. You brushed the clay ribbons and dust from the bench into a small pile, and then swept the pile into a bucket that you would later add to the clay pit, where the scraps would be soaked and reformed into fresh, workable material. Nothing was wasted, everything returned to the cycle. The workshop was quiet and orderly, the lamps waiting on their board, the wheel standing still in its place, the tools resting in their neat row. You stood for a moment in the center of the room, your hands resting lightly at your sides, and you felt the deep, pervasive calm that came at the end of a stage of work, the quiet pause before the next stage began. The clay had been dug and wedged, thrown and assembled, trimmed and smoothed and decorated, and now it was ready to meet the fire. The thought was a peaceful one, and it settled into your mind like a stone settling into still water, sending out gentle ripples that faded as quickly as they came. Outside, the day continued its slow, steady passage, and inside, the workshop held its silence, patient and calm, waiting for whatever would come next. The day had come for the kiln. You knew at the moment you opened the workshop shutters and felt the dry, warm air against your face, the kind of air that pulled moisture from the clay and left it pale and hard and ready for the fire. The lamp bodies on their wooden bats had dried completely overnight, their surfaces now a uniform, chalky white, and when you lifted one and tapped it gently with the fingernail, it gave a faint, high-pitched ring, the sound of clay that held no more water. They were fragile still, unfired and brittle, but they had reached the point where they could be handled without danger of warping and could be stacked in the kiln without risk of collapse. You set the lamp back in its place and looked along the rows, counting them silently, marking the number in your memory, and then you turned your attention to the tasks that lay ahead. The kiln shed stood at the far end of the yard, a low, square structure built of the same wattle and daub as the workshop, with a roof of clay tiles that had weathered to a dark, mossy brown. Inside the shed, the kiln itself rose from the earthen floor like a broad, squat creature, a construction of brick and clay that you had built yourself many seasons ago and had repaired and patched and tended ever since. It was a simple updraft kiln, the kind that potters had used for centuries across the empire, and it consisted of a circular chamber with a domed roof, a great floor made of perforated clay bars set above a firebox, and a stoke hole at one side where the fuel would be fed. The walls were thick, 2 bricks deep in places, and they were blackened on the inside from countless firings, the surface coated with a glassy, vitrified layer where the wood ash had melted and fused with the clay. You walked to the kiln shed through the morning quiet, the ground underfoot still cool and slightly damp from the night, and you pulled open the heavy wooden door that protected the kiln from rain and wind. The door swung outward with a low groan, and the smell that came from within was a dry, ancient smell, the smell of baked earth and old charcoal, and the faint, sharp tang of wood ash that had settled into every pore of the brickwork. It was a smell you knew as well as the smell of the workshop, and it brought with it a sense of quiet anticipation, the feeling of a task that was familiar and steady and slow. The kiln chamber stood empty and dark, the great floor visible as a pattern of grey bars and black gaps, and the stoke hole opened like a small, hungry mouth at the base of the near wall. All was clean, all was ready. You had swept the chamber after the last firing, removing the spent ash and the broken shards of any pots that had not survived, and now the interior was bare and waiting. You went back to the workshop and fetched a wide, flat basket woven from willow withies, the kind you used for carrying pots across the yard. The basket was light and sturdy, its handles worn smooth by your grip, and you set it on the bench beside the drying board. One by one, you lifted the unfired lamps from their bats and laid them in the basket, arranging them so that they did not touch one another, their spouts and handles nested in the spaces between. The clay was so dry now that it felt almost weightless, and each lamp had a cool, powdery surface that left a faint dust on your palms. You worked slowly, carefully, because a lamp at this stage could crack from a sudden bump or a too firm grip, and you held each piece with the gentle attention that the unfired clay demanded. When the basket was full but not overfull, you lifted it with both hands and carried it out across the yard to the kiln shed. The path was short, 20 paces or so, and you walked with a measured, even gait, watching the ground before you for any stone or unevenness that might cause a stumble. The basket swayed gently with your movement, and the lamps inside made a soft, musical clinking, a delicate sound like tiny bells heard from a distance. You reached the kiln shed and set the basket down on the packed earth floor just outside the chamber door, then straightened up and let out a slow breath, the warmth of the sun now full on your shoulders. The first task inside the kiln chamber was to prepare the fire bars, the horizontal clay beams that formed the grate floor and would support the weight of the stacked lamps while allowing the heat and flame to rise from the firebox below. You knelt by the stokehole and peered into the dark space beneath the grate, checking that no debris had fallen through since the last firing. The ash pit was clean, the floor swept, and the air that rose from it was cool and still. You then inspected each bar of the grate, running your fingers along the clay surfaces to feel for any cracks or weaknesses. The bars were thick and sturdy, darkened by repeated firings to a deep smoky grey, and they were set with small gaps between them, just wide enough to let the flame pass, but narrow enough to keep the pots from falling through. You found one bar that had a tiny hairline crack near its center, a flaw you had noticed before, but which had not yet widened, and you made a mental note to replace it after this firing. For now, it would hold. Next, you needed to prepare the kiln shelf, a flat circular clay disc that sat on short pillars above the grate and provided an additional level for stacking. The shelf was heavy, and you lifted it with care, setting it to one side while you laid out the first layer of lamps directly on the grate. You had learned long ago that stacking a kiln was a kind of puzzle, a three-dimensional arrangement that required you to fit as many pieces as possible into the available space without allowing them to touch one another, because during the firing the clay would expand slightly, and any contact point could fuse the pieces together into a single, useless lump. The solution was to use small clay supports, rolled pellets or coiled rings that you placed between the pots to maintain a gap, and you had a whole basket of these supports ready, made from scraps of clay that you had saved and dried during previous sessions. You knelt on the floor of the chamber, the basket of lamps at your side, and he began to place the first lamp onto the grate. You chose a lamp from the basket and set it down gently, its flat base resting securely on two of the fire bars, its spout pointing toward the center of the chamber, and its handle facing outward. You then took a small rolled pellet of clay, a support no larger than a bean, and placed it on the rim of the lamp, where it would hold the next piece above it, just clear of the surface. The pellets sat there like a tiny, patient sentinel, and you tested its placement with a light touch to make sure it would not roll off. Satisfied, you reached for a second lamp and placed it beside the first, leaving a finger's width of space between their walls so the heat could circulate freely. The stacking continued in this quiet, methodical way, the lamps arranged in a close but careful pattern across the grate floor. You placed them row by row, working from the back of the chamber toward the front, each lamp set down with the same slow, deliberate care. The sounds of the work were soft and muffled, the faint, gritty scrape of clay against clay as you adjusted a position, the whisper of your tunic as you leaned forward, the occasional small puff of breath as you blew a speck of dust from a lamp rim. The air in the kiln shed was cooler than outside, and the dim light filtering through the doorway gave everything a muted, shadowy quality, the pale lamps seeming to glow faintly in the darkness, like stones at the bottom of a stream. When the great floor was fully covered with a single layer of lamps, you paused and sat back on your heels, surveying the arrangement. The lamps were all properly spaced, the supports in place, the spouts and handles all aligned so that none protruded into the path of the flame that would soon rise through the grate. You then began the second layer, lifting the lamps with extra care now, because they would be sitting on the rims of the pieces below, supported only by the small clay pellets. You placed each lamp so that its base rested on at least 3 of the supports, distributing the weight evenly, and you tested the stability with a gentle downward pressure before moving on to the next. The stacking grew upward, the chamber filling slowly with the pale ghostly forms of the unfired lamps, each one nested within the spaces of the layers beneath, the whole arrangement taking on the character of a quiet, orderly hive. The kiln shelf was the next component to add. You lifted the heavy clay disc and set it carefully onto the 4 short pillars that rose from the corners of the grate, fitting it into place with a soft, solid, settling sound. The shelf was flat and smooth, its surface dusted with a thin layer of kiln wash, a mixture of clay and water that would prevent the pots from sticking to it during the firing. You checked that the shelf was level by placing a small clay ball on its surface and watching to see if it rolled. The ball stayed put, and you nodded to yourself and began to stack the remaining lamps on this upper level. The work on the upper shelf was the same as on the grate, the same careful placement, the same small supports, the same patient attention to spacing and alignment. You had made a good number of lamps for this order, more than usual, and the kiln chamber was gradually filling to its capacity, the lamps arranged in a dense but orderly congregation that climbed from the grate to just below the domed roof. The last few pieces were smaller lamps, the compact ones you had thrown as variations, and they fit neatly into the remaining gaps at the edges of the shelf, tucked in like eggs in a nest. When the final lamp was placed and the last support set, you knelt back and let your hands rest on your thighs, and you looked at the filled kiln with a quiet, tired satisfaction. The kiln was now fully stacked, the unfired lamps waiting in their careful arrangement, their pale surfaces almost luminous in the dim light. They looked fragile and patient, like a gathering of silent beings awaiting the transformation that would come not through words or actions, but through the slow, invisible work of heat and time. You reached into the chamber and gently touched the rim of the nearest lamp, feeling its cool, dry surface, and then you withdrew your hand and rose to your feet, your knees stiff from kneeling on the hard floor. Outside the kiln shed, the morning had advanced to its middle hours, the sun high and warm, the shadows short and sharp-edged. You walked back to the workshop and fetched a broom, a simple bundle of twigs bound to a wooden handle, and you returned to the kiln shed to sweep the area clean. You brushed the earthen floor around the kiln, gathering the stray bits of clay and the dust that had fallen during the stacking, and you swept it all into a small pile that you collected in a flat wooden scoop and added to the clay pit bucket. The shed floor was now clean and tidy, the space around the kiln clear of any debris that might catch a stray spark when the fire was lit. You checked the stokehole one more time, peering into the firebox and confirming that the ash pit was empty and the air passage was clear, and then you stepped back and surveyed the shed with a quiet, assessing gaze. Everything was ready. The lamps were stacked, the supports in place, the kiln shelf level, the grate sound, the floor swept. All that remained was the fire. You stood for a moment in the doorway of the kiln shed, your hand resting on the rough wooden frame, and you looked out across the yard toward the workshop, where the wheel and the bench and the tools sat waiting for the next cycle of making. The sun was warm on your face, and a light breeze stirred the dust at your feet, and in the distance a rooster crowed, a thin, bright sound that carried across the settlement and faded into the quiet. You felt a deep, quiet calm, the calm of work completed and work waiting, the calm of a potter whose kiln was full and whose fire was yet to be lit. You closed the kiln shed door and latched it, then walked back to the workshop to wash your hands and to take a short rest before the firing began. The morning's work had been steady and unhurried, and your body felt the pleasant, tired heaviness that came from lifting and carrying and kneeling. You sat on the stool by the bench, the same stool you had sat on while throwing the lamps, and you poured yourself a cup of water from the jug, drinking it slowly while your eyes moved across the empty drying board, the clean tools, the silent wheel. The workshop was at rest, its work done for now, and the kiln shed across the yard held the quiet promise of the fire that would come later, when the sun was lower and the air was cooler and the long, slow night of the firing could begin. The early evening had settled over the settlement like a soft grey wing, the sun now fully gone behind the western hills, and the sky above the workshop fading from pale blue to a deeper, dusky violet. You had eaten the simple meal of bread, a piece of hard cheese, and a handful of olives, sitting on the stone bench outside your house while the day's last light drained away and the first bats flickered out from the eaves. The meal was quiet and unhurried, the food tasting of salt and earth, and the faint, peppery bite of the olive oil, and when you had finished, you rinsed your hands in the water bucket by the door and sat for a while longer, watching the stars come out one by one. The air was cool but not cold, and it carried the scent of wood smoke from someone else's hearth, a neighbor preparing their own evening fire. You let the stillness of the twilight wash over you, knowing that the night ahead would be long and wakeful, and then you rose and went into the house to fetch what you needed for the kiln. Beside the domestic hearth, where the remains of your own cooking fire still glowed with a deep vermilion heart, you took a small, heavy clay pot with a fitted lid and a handle wrapped in cord. The pot was blackened on the outside from years of service, and you lifted the lid carefully, the warm air inside it shifting with a faint, feathery sound. Using iron tongs, you selected several of the largest, most enduring embers from the hearth, the ones that glowed with a steady, deep orange light and were coated in a fine white ash, and you transferred them one by one into the clay pot. Each ember landed with a soft, muffled tink against the ceramic, and the pot grew warm in your hand as the lid was fitted back into place. You wrapped a length of thick cloth around the handle to protect your palm, then carried the pot out into the yard, the embers inside it making a faint, rustling sigh as you walked. The path to the kiln shed was a pale ribbon of dust in the starlight, and you walked it slowly, your sandals making soft, crunching sounds on the scattered gravel. The kiln shed itself was a dark shape against the slightly less dark sky, its roof tiles outlined in faint silhouette, and you pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air within was cool and absolutely still, and it smelled of dry clay and old charcoal, and the faint mineral tang of the brickwork, a smell that you had known since you first built this kiln, and that always carried with it the memory of past firings, the long nights of watching and waiting. You set the clay pot down on the packed earth floor beside the stokehole and straightened up, letting your eyes adjust to the deeper darkness of the shed. The kiln loomed before you, its domed roof barely visible, and the dark mouth of the stokehole gaped at its base like an open door into some quiet subterranean place. You knelt by the stokehole and reached for the small clay lamp that you had left there earlier, its wick trimmed and its reservoir full of oil. You lit it with a spark from your flint and iron, the small flame springing up with a soft yellow flutter, and the interior of the shed became visible in a warm, flickering circle of light. The lamp you set on a small stone ledge to one side of the stokehole, where it would burn through the night and provide enough light to work by. Its flame was steady and small, and it cast long, dancing shadows of the brickwork across the walls, shadows that swayed gently with every tiny movement of the air. Now you opened the clay pot and looked inside. The embers were still glowing brightly, pulsing with a soft internal light that brightened and dimmed as you watched, and a thin curl of smoke rose from them and disappeared into the darkness above. You tipped the pot carefully and rolled the embers out into the firebox, just behind the grate, where they would have access to air but would not be smothered by the ash. They lay there in a small glowing heap, the heat already beginning to warm the floor of the firebox, and you sat back on your heels and looked at them for a moment. These tiny, living sparks that would soon become the fire that transformed the clay. The kindling was ready and waiting in a large basket beside the kiln, a collection of the driest, most brittle twigs and straw you had gathered from the woodpile and the threshing floor over the past days. You took a handful of straw first, the pale golden stalks crackling softly in your grip, and you arranged it loosely over the embers, forming a light, airy nest that would catch the flame quickly. The straw settled with a faint rustle, and you watched for a long suspended moment as the heat from the embers began to work on it, the stalks nearest the embers darkening and then beginning to curl. A tiny wisp of smoke appeared, so faint it was almost invisible, and then it thickened, and then with a soft breathy puff a flame appeared, a small orange tongue that licked up through the straw and began to grow. You fed the flame with more straw, adding it a pinch at a time, placing each new handful just at the edge of the burning mass so that the fire would spread outward without suffocating itself. The straw burned with a bright, quick flame that made a cheerful crackling sound and sent up a column of pale smoke that rose through the grate, curling around the unfired lamps and disappearing into the upper chamber. The smoke had a sweet, grassy smell, the smell of the field in high summer, and it filled the kiln shed with a pleasant, comforting aroma. You watched the flames closely, your face warmed by the glow, and you listened to the soft, busy sounds of the fire, the crackle of the straw, the faint hiss of moisture being driven out, the occasional pop of a seed head exploding in the heat. When the straw had burned down to a bed of glowing filaments, you began to add the twigs, small dry sticks of hazel and birch that you had cut to the length of your forearm and split into thin slivers. You laid the first twigs across the embers with care, placing them so that they did not crush the burning straw, but instead rested lightly above it, allowing the air to flow through. The twigs caught after a few moments, their bark blackening and then peeling back to reveal the bright burning wood beneath, and the flames grew larger and more robust, their color deepening from pale yellow to a warmer, richer orange. The sound of the fire changed too, the rapid crackle of the straw giving way to a steadier, more measured hiss and pop as the wood began to burn in earnest. You sat back on the low stool that you had placed beside the stokehole, a simple wooden seat that you had used for so many firings that it had become shaped to your body, and you settled into the rhythm of tending. The rhythm was a simple one. Watch the fire, assess its hunger, and feed it just enough to keep it growing without letting it race ahead of itself. The first hours of a firing were the most delicate, the time when the clay was still full of the last traces of atmospheric moisture, the water that clung to the particles even after weeks of drying. If the fire was forced too quickly, that water would turn to steam, and the steam would have nowhere to go, and the lamps would crack or shatter under the pressure. The firing had to be slow, so slow that the heat crept upward like a tide, gradual and unstoppable, giving the clay time to release its moisture peacefully into the smoke. You added more twigs, a few at a time, placing them with a deliberate, unhurried motion that had become second nature to you. Each twig you selected from the basket by feel, your fingers running over the rough bark and the smooth split surfaces, and you fed it into the firebox with a gentle, almost tender gesture. The flames received each new offering with a brief, bright flare, and then they settled back into their steady, consuming work. The heat from the stoke hole was now a pleasant, radiant warmth on your face and hands, and you could feel it beginning to soak into the fabric of your tunic and the skin beneath. The lamp on the ledge burned quietly beside you, its small flame a twin to the larger fire in the box, and the shadows on the walls swayed and danced in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Time passed in the way it always passed during a firing, which is to say that it stopped behaving like time at all. You did not count the hours, you simply sat on the stool and watched the fire and fed the fire, and the night deepened around the kiln shed without you noticing it happen. The crackling of the wood was a constant, gentle music, and the smoke that rose through the kiln chamber grew thicker and more fragrant as the wood supply shifted from the quick-burning twigs to the slightly larger pieces of split branch that you began to introduce. These pieces were as thick as your thumb, cut from seasoned oak that had been drying in the woodpile since the previous winter, and they burned with a slower, denser flame that gave off a deep, resonant heat. The firebox began to glow with a steady orange light that illuminated every brick and every bar of the grate, and the inside of the kiln chamber, visible through the spy hole near the top of the dome, slowly changed from pitch black to a very deep, very dark red. You stood up from the stool to stretch your legs, the muscles in your back and thighs easing with the movement, and you walked a few paces around the kiln shed, keeping your blood moving. The shed was warm now, the air dry and smelling strongly of wood smoke, and the walls themselves seemed to radiate a gentle heat. You paused at the spy hole and held your hand near the opening, feeling the faint hot breath of the kiln against your palm, and you peered inside to check the state of the lamps. They were still pale, still unchanged, but a faint rosy blush was beginning to tint their surfaces, the first sign that the heat was reaching them. You nodded to yourself and returned to the stool, and you added another piece of oak to the fire. The rhythm of the feeding continued, a slow, steady pulse that matched the beating of your own heart. You would sit for a while, watching the flames, listening to the sounds of the fire, and then you would reach into the wood basket and select a new piece, placing it carefully into the firebox and adjusting its position with the iron poker until it sat just right. The poker was a long, slender rod with a hooked tip, and you used it to shift the burning wood, to create channels for the air, to break apart any log that was smothering its neighbor. The iron grew warm in your hand, then hot, and you handled it with a cloth wrapped around the grip, the same cloth you had used to carry the ember pot. The motions were repetitive, but not dull, each one a small necessary act that contributed to the great slow transformation taking place inside the kiln. You drank some water from the leather skin that hung on a peg by the door, the water cool and slightly earthy tasting from the leather, and you poured a little into a shallow bowl for the kiln shed's resident lizard, a small brown creature that lived in a crack in the wall, and that sometimes came out on warm nights to watch the fire with its unblinking golden eyes. The lizard was not there now, but the water would be waiting for it when it emerged. You wiped your mouth with the back of your hand and returned to the stool, settling back into the quiet, watchful state that the fire demanded. The night deepened further, the stars outside growing brighter and colder, even as the kiln shed grew warmer and more enveloping. The sounds of the settlement had long since faded away, and the only noises now were the noises of the fire and the occasional distant call of an owl from the direction of the stream. The smoke that rose from the kiln's small chimney, a simple clay pipe set into the roof, was invisible against the dark sky, but you could smell it, the rich, woody scent of it, drifting down and mixing with the cooler outside air. You stepped out of the shed once, just for a moment, and looked up at the sky. The stars were a dense, glittering field, and the Milky Way stretched across the zenith like a river of faint, frozen light. The air was cool and clean, and it felt good on your smoke-warmed face, but you did not linger, because the fire was calling you back, its steady, consuming hunger, a quiet demand that you could not ignore for long. Back on the stool, you fed the fire with a larger log now, a piece of oak as thick as your wrist, and you watched as the flames wrapped themselves around it and began their slow, patient work of turning wood into heat and ash and smoke. The firebox was now a glowing cavern of orange and yellow and the deepest red, and the heat that radiated from it was intense enough that you had to lean back slightly on the stool, your face shielded by your raised hand when you leaned in to add more fuel. The kiln chamber above the grate had shifted from its deep red to a brighter, more confident orange, and through the spy hole you could see that the lamps were now glowing faintly, their pale surfaces transformed into warm, translucent shells that seemed to hold the light within themselves. It was a beautiful sight, a quiet, secret beauty that only you would ever see, and you gazed at it for a long, still moment before closing the spy hole and returning to your work. The hours passed in this way, a slow, liquid flow of time that was measured not in minutes, but in the gradual consumption of the woodpile and the gradual brightening of the kiln's interior. You added fuel, adjusted the air, watched the flames, drank water, stretched your legs, and then sat down to begin the cycle again. The lamp on the ledge burned steadily, its oil reservoir now half empty, and you made a mental note to refill it before the night was through. The lizard had appeared at last, creeping out from its crack in the wall and lapping at the water in the bowl with a tiny flickering tongue, and then it had retreated back into the shadows where it belonged. You were alone with the fire, and the fire was good company, quiet and undemanding, asking only that you be present and attentive and patient. By the time the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the kiln shed door, the firing had reached its middle stage, the stage where the clay was fully dehydrated and the heat was beginning to climb in earnest toward the high temperature that would vitrify the surface and turn the pale, fragile lamps into hard, ringing terracotta. The woodpile was significantly smaller, the basket of kindling was empty, and your body felt the pleasant, hollow tiredness of a night spent awake and watchful. But the fire was strong and steady, and the kiln was singing its quiet roaring song, and you knew that the hardest part of the firing was still to come. For now, though, you simply sat on the stool and watched the flames, your hands resting loosely in your lap, and you let the warmth and the sound and the slow, steady rhythm of the night carry you onward toward the morning. The fire had been burning for hours now, and the world outside the kiln shed had shrunk to a deep, quiet darkness that pressed against the walls like a held breath. You sat on the low stool beside the stoke hole, your body settled into the patient, motionless posture of the long watch, and you listened to the voice of the kiln as it breathed. The sound was no longer the busy crackle of kindling or the brisk snap of twigs. It had deepened into a low, steady roar, a continuous, throaty hum that filled the shed and vibrated gently through the floor beneath your feet. The firebox glowed with a fierce orange-white heart, and the flames that licked around the larger logs were almost transparent at their tips, a shimmering, dancing veil of heat that made the air above the stoke hole quiver and swim. You leaned forward and placed another piece of hardwood into the firebox, a split log of oak as thick as your forearm, its surface grey and dry and lightly furred with the dust of the woodpile. The log settled onto the bed of embers with a soft, crunching sound, and for a moment the flames seemed to retreat, shrinking back from the new, cold mass before they found their grip and surged upward with renewed appetite. You watched the fire take hold, the bark blackening and curling, the first small tongues of flame licking along the grain, and then you sat back on the stool and let your hands rest on your thighs, the warmth of the kiln washing over you in slow, regular waves. The long night of the firing was the part of the process that could not be hurried, the part that demanded nothing more than presence and patience and a quiet, steady attention. There was no skill to it now, no craft, only the simple, repetitive act of feeding the fire and waiting for the heat to climb. You had done this many times before, and your body knew the rhythm as well as it knew the rhythm of the wheel or the motion of wedging, sit and watch, add a log, adjust the air, sit and watch again. The hours would pass and the fire would burn, and the clay inside the chamber would transform, and all you had to do was remain awake and attentive, a quiet guardian of the heat. The kiln shed had grown very warm, the air dry and heavy with the scent of burning oak, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with a gentle, radiant heat that you could feel even through the soles of your sandals. The lamp on the stone ledge still burned beside you, its small flame now almost invisible against the greater light of the firebox, and its oil was running low, the reservoir more than half empty. You reached for the small clay jug of oil that you had brought from the house and refilled the lamp carefully, tilting the jug with a steady hand and watching the golden liquid rise slowly up the wick. The fresh oil caught the flame with a soft, satisfied glow, and the lamp brightened, casting its small circle of light back onto the wall where the shadows of the brickwork danced. You stood up from the stool to stretch your legs, the muscles in your back and shoulders easing with the movement, and you walked the few steps to the shed door to look out at the night. The door was slightly ajar, a gap just wide enough to let in a sliver of cool air and a view of the sky, and you stood there for a moment, breathing the outside air. It was cool and clean and damp, carrying the faint green smell of the fields and the distant mineral scent of the stream, and it felt good on your smoke-warmed face. The sky was a deep velvet black, scattered with stars that seemed brighter and sharper than they had been earlier in the evening, and the Milky Way was a pale glowing river that stretched from one horizon to the other. There was no moon, and the darkness was complete except for the stars, a vast, quiet darkness that made the warm, bright shed feel like a small, safe island in the middle of an endless sea. You closed the door again, leaving only a small gap at the top for the smoke to draw properly, and you returned to the stool. The firebox had burned through the last log you had added, and the bed of embers was now deep and glowing, a shifting, luminous mass of orange and red and the palest yellow. You took the iron poker and stirred the embers gently, breaking apart the larger clumps and creating channels for the air to flow through, and the fire responded with a brief, bright flare, the flames leaping up with a satisfied roar before settling back into their steady, consuming work. You added another log, placing it across the center of the firebox where the heat was strongest, and then you sat down once more and let the rhythm resume. Time moved strangely in the kiln shed, its usual orderly flow dissolving into something softer and more fluid, something that could not be measured by the steady drip of a water clock or the slow crawl of the stars. You did not count the hours because the hours did not matter. What mattered was the color of the kiln chamber, the sound of the fire, the feel of the heat on your skin. You checked these things regularly, rising from the stool every so often to climb the short wooden ladder that led to the spy hole near the top of the kiln dome. The spy hole was a small circular opening, just large enough to admit the long iron rod that you used for testing, and when you peered into it, the interior of the kiln was a vision of quiet, contained inferno. The lamps were no longer pale or chalky. They glowed now with a deep, rosy orange, the color of embers at the heart of a fire, and their surfaces had begun to take on a faint, glassy sheen as the clay particles softened and began to fuse. The heat inside the chamber was intense, a dry, shimmering presence that made the air itself seem to vibrate, and the lamps seemed to float in it, suspended in their careful arrangement like offerings in a shrine. You gazed at them for a long, quiet moment, watching the slow, subtle changes in their color, and then you took the iron rod from its hook on the wall and inserted it carefully through the spy hole. The rod was long and slender, with a flattened tip that had been coated in a thin wash of clay, and you held it inside the chamber for a slow count of 30, letting the heat soak into the metal. When you withdrew it, the tip glowed with a soft, cherry-red light, the color indicating that the temperature was climbing well, but had not yet reached the peak that would be needed for the final vitrification. You held the rod up to the lamp to read the color more accurately, noting the way the glow faded from bright red at the very tip to a darker, duller red further along the shaft. It was a good sign, a sign that the firing was progressing as it should, and you set the rod aside and climbed back down the ladder, your hands and face tingling from the brief, intense heat. The night wore on, and the feeding of the fire continued in its slow, steady rhythm. The basket of logs beside the stoke hole was gradually emptying, the pile of spent ash beneath the grate was gradually growing, and your body moved through the familiar motions with a quiet, automatic grace that required no thought. You added logs at longer intervals now, because the larger pieces burned more slowly, and you spent the time between additions simply sitting on the stool, your eyes half closed, your mind drifting in a soft, formless haze that was neither sleep nor full wakefulness. The warmth of the kiln wrapped around you like a heavy blanket, and the deep humming roar of the fire was a constant, soothing presence that filled your ears and seemed to resonate somewhere deep inside your chest. You thought, in a distant, floating way, about the lamps and the border fort and the soldiers who would use them. You pictured the small dark rooms of the barracks, the guard posts along the wall, the shrines at the crossroads, and you saw your lamps burning in all these places, their small flames pushing back the darkness, their simple, dotted rims catching the light. But the thoughts were gentle and without weight, drifting through your awareness like leaves on a slow stream, and you did not hold on to them. They came and they went, and you remained on the stool, your hands loose in your lap, your breath slow and even. At some point in the deep black hours after midnight, the lizard emerged again from its crack in the wall and crept across the floor toward the warmth of the kiln. It was a small brown creature with delicate translucent toes and eyes like tiny polished stones, and it stopped a safe distance from the stokehole and basked in the radiant heat, its throat pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. You watched it without moving, and the lizard watched the fire, and the two of you shared the quiet, wordless companionship of living things that were awake while the rest of the world slept. After a long while, the lizard turned and crept back to its crack, and you were alone again. You added more wood, a thick, knotted piece of elm that had been drying in the stack for over a year, and you adjusted its position with the poker so that it would burn evenly. The flames wrapped around it with a soft, sighing sound, and the heat from the stokehole intensified, forcing you to lean back on the stool and shield your face with your hand. The kiln was now roaring with a deep, resonant voice, and the bricks of the dome were glowing with a faint, rosy light that was visible even from the floor of the shed. The lamps inside would be incandescent now, their surfaces beginning to vitrify, the clay particles melting and fusing into a hard, glassy matrix that would ring like metal when tapped. It was the critical stage of the firing, the stage when the heat had to be held steady and the fire could not be allowed to falter, and you stayed close to the stokehole, your attention sharpening as the hours passed. The iron rod told you what you needed to know. You climbed the ladder every so often and inserted the rod through the spy hole, holding it in the heat for a longer count now, and the color of the glowing tip shifted from cherry red to a bright orange red, the color of the setting sun. The clay wash on the tip had vitrified too, turning into a thin, glassy skin that glittered faintly in the light. You held the rod steady and watched the color, waiting for it to reach the pale yellow-orange that would signal the peak temperature, the point at which the clay would be fully mature and the fire could begin its slow, gradual decline. It was not there yet, but it was close, and you climbed back down the ladder with a quiet, satisfied nod. The darkness outside the shed had begun to soften by now, the deep velvet black giving way to a faint greyish tinge that was almost too subtle to notice. It was the first tentative hint of dawn, the slow, silent turning of the earth that would soon bring the sun back to the sky. You felt it rather than saw it, a change in the quality of the air, a slight lessening of the absolute darkness, and you knew that the night was nearing its end. But the firing was not yet finished, and there was still work to do before the kiln could be sealed and left to cool. You added the last of the large logs to the firebox, a dense, heavy piece of oak that you had been saving for the final push, and you arranged the remaining embers around it with the poker, building a deep, solid bed of heat that would sustain the high temperature for several more hours. The log settled into the firebox with a low, crunching groan, and the flames rose to meet it, licking along its sides and sending up a shower of sparks that swirled briefly in the hot air before vanishing. The fire was strong and steady, its hunger now almost satisfied, and you sat back on the stool and let it burn, your eyes fixed on the glowing, shifting mass of the ember bed. The grey light outside the shed door grew gradually stronger, and the stars faded one by one, their cold, distant light swallowed by the slow, spreading dawn. A bird began to sing somewhere in the distance, a thin, tentative note that was repeated and then fell silent, and then another bird answered, and then the whole chorus began to stir, the first hesitant sounds of the waking world. You listened to the birds without moving, their song a gentle, familiar music that had accompanied the end of many firings, and you felt the tired, peaceful heaviness in your body that came from a night spent in watchful stillness. The time had come for the final check. You climbed the ladder one last time and inserted the iron rod through the spy hole, holding it in the heat for a full count of 60. When you withdrew it, the tip glowed with a pale yellow-orange light, the color of a candle flame, and the clay wash on the surface had melted into a smooth, clear glaze that reflected the firelight like a tiny mirror. The temperature had reached its peak, and the lamps inside the chamber were now fully vitrified, their clay bodies transformed into hard, durable terracotta that would hold oil without leaking and would ring with a clear, high note when struck. The firing was complete. You climbed down the ladder and stood for a moment by the stokehole, looking at the fire that had burned through the night and was now beginning to settle into its final, gentle decline. The last log was still burning, but its edges were soft and rounded, and the flames that played around it were lower and lazier than they had been. You took the flat stone that stood propped against the wall beside the kiln, a heavy rectangular slab of fired clay that you had made for this very purpose, and you lifted it with both hands, feeling its solid, gritty weight. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, you placed the stone against the mouth of the stokehole, sealing the firebox and cutting off the air. The effect was immediate and quiet. The roar of the fire softened to a low, muffled hum, and the glow from the stokehole vanished, replaced by the dark, flat face of the stone. The kiln was now sealed, the fire inside slowly consuming the last of the oxygen before settling into a deep, airless slumber, and the heat would now begin its long, gradual decline, cooling over the course of a full day or more until the lamps could be safely removed. You pressed the stone firmly into place with the heel of your hand, checking that it sat flush against the brickwork, and then you stepped back and let out a long, slow breath. The kiln shed was quiet now, the deep, roaring voice of the fire replaced by a soft, settling silence that was broken only by the faint, occasional tick of cooling brick. The lamp on the ledge still burned, its flame small and steady, and the grey light of dawn was now strong enough to fill the shed with a pale, colourless glow. You stood in the centre of the floor, your hands resting at your sides, and you listened to the silence, a silence that was full of the memory of the fire and the promise of the finished lamps waiting inside the dark, sealed chamber. The long night of the firing was over, and outside the door the world was waking slowly to a new day. The flat stone sat firmly against the mouth of the stokehole, and the kiln was silent now, sealed and dark and hot. You stood in the center of the shed for a long moment, your body still humming with the deep, resonant roar of the fire that had filled the space all night, and you felt the quiet settle around you like a soft, heavy blanket. The lamp on the stone ledge still burned, its flame small and yellow in the growing grey light of dawn, and you reached out and pinched the wick between your thumb and forefinger, extinguishing it with a faint, smoky hiss. The shed fell into a deeper dimness, lit only by the pale glow seeping through the gap in the door, and the smell of wood smoke and hot clay hung thick and motionless in the air. Your body was tired in the way that felt clean and earned, a pleasant, hollow weariness that spread through your shoulders and back and legs. You had been awake for the whole of the night, sitting on the low stool and feeding the fire and watching the slow, steady climb of the heat. And now that the work was done, your limbs felt heavy, and your eyelids had a soft, sandy weight to them. You walked to the shed door and pulled it open, letting the cool, fresh air of the early morning wash over you. The sky was a pale, milky grey, the stars all gone, and a thin mist lay over the fields beyond the settlement wall, a low white blanket that would burn off within the hour. The everyday hero smelled as damp earth and grass, and the faint, distant tang of the stream, and you breathed it in deeply, filling your lungs with the clean, cool freshness. The walk back to the house was short, your sandals making soft, slow sounds on the packed earth of the yard, and you did not hurry. The workshop stood quiet and dark as you passed it, its shutters closed, its wheel still, its benches empty. It would wait. The kiln would wait too, sealed and cooling, its interior still glowing with a deep invisible heat that would take more than a full day to dissipate. There was nothing more to do now, nothing to tend or watch or adjust, only the long patient pause while the clay completed its transformation in the dark, airless chamber. You reached the house, pushed open the door, and went inside, where the air was cool and still, and the straw pallet in the corner waited for you with a quiet, patient welcome. You lay down on the pallet without lighting a lamp, without removing your tunic, your body sinking into the rustling, yielding straw with a long, slow sigh. The pillow was a folded piece of wool, and it smelled of home, of the faint, clean scent of the dried lavender that you kept in the chest by the wall. You closed your eyes, and the darkness behind your eyelids was deep and restful, and the last thing you were aware of before sleep took you was the distant, soft cooing of a dove from the eaves above. The sleep was deep and dreamless, the kind of sleep that comes after long, quiet wakefulness, and when you opened your eyes again, the quality of the light in the room had changed entirely. The pale grey of dawn had been replaced by a warm golden glow, the light of the full morning pouring through the small high window and casting a bright rectangle on the opposite wall. You lay still for a while, letting your body remember itself, feeling the pleasant rested heaviness in your limbs, and then you sat up slowly and rubbed your face with your hands. The weariness was gone, replaced by a quiet, clear-headed calm, and you rose from the pallet and went to the door to look out at the day. The sun was well up, the mist had burned away, and the settlement was awake and going about its quiet business. You could hear the distant cluck of chickens, the murmur of voices from the lane, the creak of a cart somewhere near the market square. The kiln shed stood across the yard, its door still open, as you had left it, and you walked over to it after a simple breakfast of bread and water, your body moving slowly and easily, still warm from the sleep. Inside the shed, the air was noticeably warmer than the outside air, and it still carried the smell of the firing, the dry, baked scent of clay and charcoal and wood ash. The flat stone was still in place against the stokehole, and you touched it lightly with the back of your hand, testing the temperature. It was warm, a deep, penetrating warmth that told you the kiln was still very hot inside, and you nodded to yourself, satisfied. The cooling was progressing as it should, slowly and steadily, and there was nothing to do but wait. You left the shed door open to let the warmth dissipate gradually, and you walked back to the workshop to attend to the small, incidental tasks that would fill the day while the kiln cooled. The workshop was as you had left it, the tools clean and in their places, the drying board empty, the wheel standing silent. You went to the wedging bench and lifted the damp cloth that covered the remaining clay, checking its moisture. The clay was still pliable, still cool and smooth to the touch, and you added a little water from the bowl and worked it briefly with your hands to keep it fresh. It would be needed soon for the next order or the next batch of household wares, but for now it was simply resting, waiting in its damp, patient state. You spent the rest of the morning on small, quiet tasks, sweeping the workshop floor, scraping the dried clay from the wheel head with a flat piece of wood, oiling the metal parts of the trimming blade to keep the iron from rusting. You sorted through the basket of kiln supports, discarding the ones that had crumbled or cracked and keeping the ones that could be reused, rolling them into a fresh batch of clay pellets that you set aside to dry. The work was light and undemanding, the kind of work that occupied your hands without occupying your mind, and your thoughts drifted easily, circling around the kiln and the lamps inside it, and the quiet, steady process of cooling that was taking place behind the sealed brick walls. At midday you walked back to the kiln shed and placed your hand against the side of the dome, feeling the warmth that radiated through the thick clay and brick. It was still very warm, but not painfully so, and you could sense that the heat had lessened since the morning. You knelt by the stokehold and put your ear close to the flat stone, listening, and you heard a faint, low sound, a soft, almost musical hum that was the sound of the kiln settling, the bricks and the clay bars and the lamps themselves contracting with tiny, incremental movements as the temperature dropped. It was a good sound, a sound that meant the cooling was even and gradual, and you straightened up and went back to the workshop, leaving the shed door open to the afternoon air. The afternoon passed in a slow, peaceful drift. You sat on the bench outside the workshop for a while, your back against the warm sun-heated wall, and you watched the clouds move across the sky, high, thin clouds that trailed their shadows across the fields. The cat from the lane came by and settled on the stone near your feet, washing its face with a slow, methodical paw, and you sat together in the quiet, the cat and the potter, the sun and the clouds, the whole world moving at a pace that was soft and unhurried. You thought about the kiln, but only distantly, the way you might think about a loaf of bread rising in a warm corner, or a pot of soup simmering on the hearth, a quiet, patient process that needed no intervention, only time. By evening, the warmth from the kiln had lessened further, and you could hold your hand against the dome for several seconds before the heat became uncomfortable. The cooling was going well, and you knew that by the following morning the chamber would be cool enough to open. You ate your evening meal sitting on the stone bench again, watching the sun set behind the hills and the sky deepen through its colors, and then you closed the kiln shed door for the night, leaving a small gap for any remaining heat to escape. And you went to bed early, your body still carrying the memory of the long night, of the firing, and the deep, restoring sleep that had followed it. The second morning dawned clear and cool, and you woke with a quiet, calm anticipation, the feeling of a task nearing its completion. You walked to the kiln shed first thing, before breakfast, and you placed your palm flat against the dome. The surface was barely warm now, a faint, residual heat that was more like the warmth of sun-heated stone than the fierce, invisible fire that had burned within. The flat stone over the stoke hole was cool to the touch, and when you pressed your ear to it, you heard no sound at all, only the deep settled silence of the cooled kiln. The firing was over, the cooling was done, and the time had come to open the chamber. You fetched a wooden mallet from the workshop, a heavy, short-handled tool that you used for tapping kiln bricks into place, and you returned to the shed. You knelt by the stoke hole and took the edge of the flat stone in both hands, wiggling it gently to break the seal where the clay and ash had fused slightly during the firing. The stone came loose with a soft, gritty scrape, and you lifted it away and set it against the wall, revealing the dark, empty mouth of the firebox behind. A thin drift of fine, white ash spilled out onto the floor, and the air that rose from the firebox was warm and dry and smelled powerfully of baked earth and charcoal. You peered inside, but there was nothing to see except the deep bed of grey ash that had been your logs and kindling, now reduced to a soft, weightless powder. The main chamber door, a larger opening set into the side of the kiln at waist height, was sealed with loose bricks and a layer of clay daub that you had applied before the firing. You took the wooden mallet and tapped gently around the edges of the seal, the dried clay cracking and falling away in small dusty chunks. The bricks came loose one by one, each one still faintly warm to the touch, and you stacked them neatly on the floor beside you, working with a slow, careful patience. The opening grew wider, and the interior of the kiln chamber became visible, a dark, shadowy space that seemed to exhale a soft, warm breath as the last brick was removed. You stood up and looked into the chamber, and the lamps were there, waiting for you. The sight of them was always the same, and always quietly, deeply satisfying. The lamps that you had loaded as pale, chalky, fragile things now glowed with a warm, rosy terracotta color, their surfaces smooth and hard and faintly lustrous, their simple patterns of dots and zigzags standing out in crisp, clean relief. They were no longer clay. They were pottery now, transformed by the fire into something durable and permanent, something that would hold oil without leaking and ring with a clear, high note when struck. The kiln supports lay between them, still white and powdery, and the lamps sat in their careful arrangement like a city of tiny, perfect buildings, each one complete and whole. You reached into the chamber and lifted the first lamp from the upper shelf, the compact small one that you had made as a variation. It came away easily, the kiln support beneath it crumbling to dust, and you held it in your hands and turned it slowly in the light from the shed door. The color was a beautiful, even, warm reddish brown, the surface smooth and hard, the handle sound and the spout perfect, the incised dots circling the rim with a neat, precise regularity. You tapped the side gently with your fingernail, and the lamp gave a clear, musical ring, the note hanging in the air for a moment before fading. It was a good lamp, a sound lamp, and you set it carefully on the clean wooden bat you had brought from the workshop, and reached into the chamber for the next one. The unloading of the kiln was a slow, careful process, the reverse of the loading, but with the added pleasure of seeing each piece in its finished state. You lifted each lamp out with both hands, brushing away the dust of the kiln supports, examining it briefly for any cracks or flaws, and then setting it on the bat or on the shelf you had cleared for the purpose. Most of the lamps were perfect, their color even, and their surfaces unblemished, the firing having gone smoothly and evenly. A few had small imperfections. A tiny crack near a handle join, where the slip had shrunk a fraction more than the body, a slight warp in a rim where the heat had been a little stronger on one side. But these were minor things, acceptable variations that would not affect the function of the lamps, and you set them aside in a separate group, the ones that you would sell at a slightly lower price or give away to the poorer households in the settlement. The unloading took most of the morning, the quiet, steady work of reaching, lifting, examining, and placing. And by the time the last lamp was out and the kiln chamber stood empty and dark, the wooden bats were full of finished pottery, rows and rows of terracotta lamps that glowed with a warm, rich color in the daylight. You stood back and looked at them, the full output of the firing, and you felt a quiet, settled satisfaction, the satisfaction of a potter whose kiln had been loaded and fired and cooled and opened, and whose work was now complete. You swept the kiln chamber clean of the remaining ash and kiln support fragments, collecting the debris in a bucket to be added to the clay pit mix, and then you left the shed door open to air the space and walked back to the workshop, carrying one of the perfect lamps in your hand. You set it on the bench by the window, where the morning light fell across its surface and brought out the subtle variations in the terracotta color, the slight darker patches where the heat had kissed it more strongly, the faint glassy sheen on the rim where the vitrification had taken best. It was a lamp like any other lamp you had made, and it was also entirely itself, a small, useful, beautiful thing that had passed through your hands and through the fire and had come out whole on the other side. You sat on the stool and looked at the lamp for a long, quiet moment, your hands resting loosely in your lap, and then you rose and went to fetch the packing crates from the store at the back of the workshop. The cart from the fort would come soon, and the lamps would need to be packed in straw and loaded for the journey north. But that was a task for the afternoon or for the following day. For now, in the quiet, sun-filled workshop, the lamps were finished, the kiln was cooling, and the long, slow cycle of making was complete. The quiet wrapped around you like a familiar, well-worn cloak, and you sat with it, patient and still, in the peace of the work that was done. The morning of the packing dawned clear and mild, the sky a pale washed blue, with a few high strands of cloud that drifted slowly toward the eastern hills. You had slept well and deeply, the kind of sleep that follows the completion of long, steady work, and you rose from the pallet in the cool grey light and went first to the workshop to look at the lamps. They sat on their wooden bats as you had left them, rows of warm terracotta forms that glowed softly in the early light, their colors ranging from a deep rosy brown to a lighter sandy hue where the kiln heat had been a little gentler. You walked along the row, letting your eyes travel over the familiar shapes, and you felt the quiet, settled satisfaction of a potter looking at finished work. There was a wholeness to them now, a completeness that the unfired clay had only suggested, and each lamp had the solid, ringing presence of something that had passed through the fire and emerged transformed. The packing crates were stored at the back of the workshop, in a small lean-to that you had built against the north wall to keep your dry goods and shipping materials protected from the weather. You unlatched the low door of the lean-to and ducked inside, the air cooler and smelling of dry wood and straw and the faint, dusty scent of the hemp rope that hung in coils from a peg. The crates were stacked against the wall, 3 of them, each one a simple, sturdy box made of pine boards that you had cut and planed and nailed together yourself. The wood was pale and rough, with small knots and a faint, resinous smell, and the joints were reinforced with small iron brackets that you had ordered from the smith in the settlement. Each crate was the same size, wide enough to hold 2 rows of lamps laid on their sides, deep enough for 3 layers, and you had used these same crates for previous orders, the wood marked here and there with the faint dark stains of earlier journeys. You dragged the crates out one by one into the workshop, the pine boards scraping softly against the packed earth floor, and you arranged them in a row near the door where the morning light was strongest. Then you fetched the straw, a large, loosely bound bundle that you had threshed and dried yourself during the late summer, the stalks long and golden and clean. The straw crackled softly as you broke the bundle open and began to line the bottom of the first crate, laying a thick, even layer that would cushion the lamps against the jolts and bumps of the cart ride north. You pressed the straw down with the flat of your hand, feeling its springy, rustling resistance, and you added a little more at the corners where the lamp's spouts and handles would need extra protection. The lamps you had selected for the order were the best of the batch, the ones with the most even color and the clearest, crispest decoration, and you had set them apart from the few imperfect pieces the night before. You lifted the first lamp from the bat, the small, compact one that you had made as a variation and that had come through the firing with a particularly beautiful rosy glow, and you held it for a moment in your hands, feeling its light, warm weight. The surface was smooth and hard, the incised dots circling the rim neat and regular, the handle firmly attached, and the spout perfectly tapered. You wrapped a thin twist of straw around the handle to protect it from rubbing against its neighbors, and then you laid the lamp carefully in the crate, settling it into the bed of straw with the spout pointing inward and the handle facing the side. The packing was a slow, methodical process, a kind of quiet, final conversation with each lamp before it left your hands. You worked without hurry, selecting each piece, wrapping it with straw where needed, and nestling it into the crate with a gentle, deliberate touch. The lamps fitted together in the space like puzzle pieces, their rounded bodies tucked against one another with straw packed firmly between them, and you built the first layer slowly, adjusting and readjusting until every lamp was secure and nothing wobbled or shifted when you pressed down lightly on the top. The sounds of the work were soft and rustling, the whisper of the straw as you teased it apart, the faint, muffled clink of terracotta touching terracotta, the creak of the wooden crate as you leaned over it. The morning light grew brighter and warmer, and a small, inquisitive fly buzzed in through the open shutter and circled the room before settling on the window frame. When the first layer was complete, you laid a thick mat of straw over the top, pressing it down evenly to create a cushion for the next layer, and then you began again, selecting more lamps from the bats and placing them with the same patient care. The second layer required a slightly different arrangement because the lamps in this batch were a little larger, the wider ones you had thrown for the guard posts, and you had to angle them slightly so that their spouts did not press against the walls of the crate. You worked this out by trial and adjustment, shifting a lamp a finger's width to the left, adding a little more straw beneath one rim, and you did not rush. There was no hurry, no deadline pressing, only the steady, peaceful pace of packing. The third layer went in more easily, the smaller lamps that were left fitting into the spaces at the top, and then the first crate was full. You took a handful of clean straw and spread it over the final layer, filling every gap and hollow, and then you lifted the wooden lid and set it in place. The lid fitted snugly, the boards cut to overlap the sides, and you tapped it down gently with the heel of your hand, until it sat flush. From the shelf you took a length of hemp cord, thick and rough and smelling faintly of the fields, and you began to tie the lid down, threading the cord through the iron brackets and pulling it tight with a series of firm, even knots. The cord bit into the wood with a soft creaking sound, and when you had finished the crate was solid and secure, ready for the journey. You moved on to the second crate, and then the third, repeating the same slow, careful process. Each crate was a little different because the lamps inside were a little different, and you adjusted the packing to suit the shapes, adding extra straw around a handle that stuck out a little further, padding the base more thickly when the lamps were heavier. Your hands moved in the familiar rhythm, and your mind drifted into the same quiet, unfocused calm that had accompanied you through the throwing and the trimming and the firing. The work was repetitive but not dull, each lamp a small individual presence that you acknowledged and then placed, and the crates filled gradually, the pale wood and the golden straw and the warm terracotta all blending into a quiet, pleasing harmony. By the time the third crate was packed and tied, the sun had climbed well into the sky and the workshop was bright and warm. The wooden bats were empty now, the rows of lamps gone, and the crates stood in a neat row by the door, solid and square and heavy with their contents. You brushed the loose straw from your